I gripped the cold cell phone against my ear, staring at the glowing laptop screen that displayed a verified offshore balance of $45 million. This was the hidden trust account belonging to my late husband, a man who claimed he earned $800 a month while forcing me to work 80-hour weeks to cover our mortgage. I pressed the phone tighter, waiting for his private wealth manager to explain the numbers. Marcus did not offer an apology or a fabricated corporate excuse. He simply breathed into the receiver and whispered 4 chilling words. "He is not dead." The line clicked, dead. Before my chest could even process the sudden void, heavy fists began pounding violently against my front door. It was my mother-in-law, arriving with a locksmith to officially evict me from the modest Chicago condo I had paid for entirely on my own. I did not drop the phone. I did not collapse onto the linoleum floor in a puddle of tears. As a 32-year-old senior anti-money laundering investigator, I deal with fraudulent ghosts every single day. I simply closed the laptop, locking the offshore routing numbers into my encrypted hard drive, and turned toward the entryway. Before I execute this phantom husband, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe. The heavy brass deadbolt on my front door clicked sharply. I turned away from the kitchen island just as the thick oak door swung open. A man in a grease-stained jacket stood in the threshold holding a power drill. But he quickly stepped aside to let the true threat enter the room. Vivian, my mother-in-law, marched into the modest Chicago condo wearing a pristine beige cashmere coat. She did not offer a greeting or wipe the snow from her boots. She stopped in the center of the living room, reached into her oversized designer handbag, and threw a thick stack of legal papers directly onto my glass coffee table. "Get your things and get out," Vivian commanded, her voice echoing harshly. I looked down at the documents resting on the glass. The bold black heading read, "Notice of immediate foreclosure and estate seizure." Now, for the past 5 months, I had worked grueling 80-hour weeks to pay the $2,500 mortgage on this property. Elias had claimed he only brought in $800 a month doing part-time data entry, leaving the suffocating financial burden entirely on my shoulders. Vivian crossed her arms, stepping closer to the coffee table. "My son died completely bankrupt," Vivian sneered, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "The bank is seizing this property today." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend the thousands of dollars I had poured into this home to keep us afloat. I simply lowered my gaze, scanning the physical details of the woman standing before me for the past 3 years. Vivian had played the role of the impoverished, grieving mother, constantly begging me to pay her utility bills and cover her weekly grocery tabs. But right now, the toes of her shoes poked out from beneath the hem of her tailored trousers. They were red-soled Italian leather pumps, costing at least $1,500. A woman drowning in her deceased son's debt does not purchase brand-new, ultra-luxury footwear. I picked up the heavy stack of documents from the coffee table. The paper felt cheap and flimsy, lacking the premium, watermarked cotton stock utilized by legitimate financial institutions in Cook County. I flipped past the aggressive legal jargon to the final page, engaging the precise analytical focus I utilized every single day as a senior anti-money laundering investigator. My eyes locked onto the notary seal stamped near the bottom margin. The ink was a flat, uniform blue. A legitimate state-issued notary press leaves a microscopic, raised indentation on the paper fibers, a physical impression you can feel with your thumb. I brushed my index finger over the seal. It was completely smooth. Furthermore, the alignment of the signature block was fractionally skewed, a hallmark of poorly layered digital files. This was a low-resolution scan, printed from a standard commercial inkjet printer. The eviction notice was a complete, sloppy forgery. Vivian was not acting on behalf of a legitimate bank. She was actively funded and directed by whoever controlled the $45 million offshore trust I had just discovered on Elias's laptop. "You have exactly 10 minutes, Vivian stated, her perfectly manicured fingernail tapping impatiently. I set the fraudulent documents back down on the glass. I did not explain the legal discrepancies or threaten to call the local police. Arguing with a pawn is a massive waste of tactical energy. My jaw tightened slightly as I cataloged her smug expression. "Poverty is a quiet prison, and you belong in it," Vivian whispered, her lips curling into a cruel smirk. I held her gaze for 3 full seconds. My chest tightened with a sharp, familiar indignation, but I instantly suppressed the physiological reaction. I forced my breathing into a slow, controlled rhythm, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. I turned my back on her and walked calmly down the short hallway toward the master bedroom. Vivian let out a loud, mocking laugh, clearly assuming my silence was an admission of total, pathetic defeat. I pushed the bedroom door open and pulled a single leather duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet. I did not waste time packing dresses, framed photographs, or the sentimental items I had collected over the course of our marriage. I only needed my weapons. I walked over to my hidden desk drawer, pressed my thumb against the biometric lock, and retrieved my heavy, black, encrypted hard drive. This specific device contained the raw metadata, the offshore routing numbers, and the digital footprints linking the phantom $45 million to Marcus and his corrupt banking network. I dropped the drive into the leather bag, securing it safely beneath a thick wool sweater. I zipped the bag shut. The sharp metallic sound cut clearly through the quiet bedroom. I swung the heavy strap over my shoulder and walked back out into the living room. Vivian was already directing the locksmith, pointing at the door frame as he prepared to hollow out the locking mechanism. She watched me approach with my single bag, her chest puffing out with victorious arrogance. She truly believed she had just rendered me homeless and helpless. "Leave the keys on the counter," Vivian demanded, pointing a sharp finger toward the kitchen island. I reached into my trouser pocket, pulled out the silver key ring, and dropped it onto the granite countertop. The metal clattered loudly against the stone. I did not look at her again. I adjusted the heavy leather strap on my shoulder, stepped around the locksmith, and walked out the door. I stepped out of the building and onto the Chicago sidewalk. The freezing wind whipped fiercely down the street, biting into my cheeks and tearing through the thin fabric of my dark trench coat. The sky above the city was a heavy, oppressive gray, threatening an icy downpour. I pulled my collar up and began walking briskly down the pavement. Refusing to shiver, I did not call a cab. I did not frantically search for a hotel on my phone. The physical loss of the condo meant absolutely nothing in the grand equation. The real war was going to be fought entirely in the digital shadows. 3 blocks away, a small independent coffee shop sat wedged between 2 towering brick apartment buildings. I pushed the heavy glass door open. The warm air smelled strongly of roasted espresso and damp wool coats. The cafe was mostly empty, occupied only by a few local college students staring intently at their glowing screens. I bypassed the ordering counter entirely and walked directly to a small wooden table tucked into the darkest, most secluded corner of the room. I sat down on the rigid wooden chair and pulled my encrypted laptop from the leather duffel bag. I flipped the screen open. The machine hummed to life, projecting a harsh, pale white light across my face. Leaving the secure network of the condo forced my hand prematurely. I needed to establish an immediate, highly secure connection to the offshore ledger to ensure Marcus had not already locked the trust following our brief, chilling phone call. I plugged my secure hard drive into the side port of the laptop. I bypassed the public cafe network entirely, launching a military-grade virtual private network that routed my signal through 3 different international servers before bouncing back to the United States. This created a digital ghost protocol, masking my physical location. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing the exact sequence of offshore routing numbers I had extracted from Elias's hidden file just 30 minutes ago. The screen blinked black for a fraction of a second. Then, the massive financial balance materialized on the high-definition display. $45 million. The staggering sum was still sitting there, resting quietly in a corporate holding account administered by Vanguard Apex Financial. But viewing the highly classified ledger from an external, unregistered Internet Protocol address carried a massive tactical risk. The moment my screen populated the raw financial data, a small red indicator light flashed in the top right corner of my terminal. It was a ping. My intrusion had just triggered an automated security tripwire built directly into the offshore account's elite corporate firewall. I watched the red light pulse steadily against the dark background. I knew exactly what that digital pulse meant. Miles away in a high-rise executive suite in the financial district, Marcus was currently receiving a blaring, high-priority intrusion alert on his secure banking dashboard. The corrupt wealth manager now knew that someone was actively digging into his dead client's hidden fortune. I stared at the blinking red light. I did not disconnect my feed. I simply leaned back against the hard wooden chair, quietly cracking my knuckles as I waited for the panicked banker to make his first desperate move. My phone vibrated violently against the scratched wooden table, shattering the quiet, ambient hum of the coffee shop. The screen lit up with a rapid, chaotic succession of automated text messages from my primary financial institution. The notifications displayed a chilling reality. Transaction declined. Account frozen due to suspicious activity. Available balance $0. Marcus was moving exactly as I had predicted. The corrupt wealth manager was attempting to cut off my oxygen supply, stripping me of my immediate resources before I could dig any deeper into his hidden corporate ledger. He wanted to paralyze me with sudden, terrifying poverty. Before the third automated text message could even fade from the locked screen, an incoming call overrode the digital display. The caller identification boldly declared Vanguard Apex Executive Branch. I did not rush. I reached out, picked up the phone, and pressed the cold glass against my ear. I did not offer a polite greeting. "You are playing a very dangerous game, Layla," Marcus stated, his voice dripping with condescension and breathless panic. I kept my eyes locked onto the glowing monitor of my laptop. I reached for my paper cup and took a slow, deliberate sip of the black coffee. The scalding liquid burned the back of my throat, keeping me completely grounded in the physical moment. "You have unauthorized access to a highly restricted corporate trust," Marcus continued rapidly, his breathing shallow and loud over the receiver. "I have just frozen your personal checking and savings accounts. If you do not disconnect from that offshore network immediately, I am reporting you to federal authorities for criminal cyber intrusion." I lowered the coffee cup, placing it silently back onto the table. I did not gasp. I did not plead for him to restore my grocery money. "You are a grieving widow who is out of her depth," Marcus sneered, attempting to mask his escalating terror with heavy, aggressive legal jargon. "I have flagged your biometric identity across our entire banking network. Step away from the computer, or I will have you arrested before the end of the day." "The authorities do not scare me, Marcus," I replied evenly, my voice a quiet, lethal whisper. "But they are going to absolutely terrify you." The line clicked dead. He had terminated the connection, retreating back behind his corporate firewall, believing he had successfully intimidated a desperate woman into total submission. I set the phone face down on the table. My chest tightened slightly at the thought of my zeroed-out savings. A momentary physiological spike of indignation, but I instantly suppressed it. Panic is a luxury I could not afford, and arguing with a frightened banker was a massive waste of tactical energy. I turned my absolute focus back to the high-definition display. Marcus assumed he was dealing with an ordinary civilian. He assumed a basic financial freeze would act as a suffocating restraint. He completely failed to realize that he had just declared a digital war against a senior federal contractor. For the past 7 years, my primary occupation involved tracking down ghost assets for the government. As a senior anti-money laundering investigator, I built the exact forensic tracking algorithms that corrupt wealth managers spent millions of dollars trying to bypass. I did not waste time calling a customer service representative to beg for my money back. I simply opened a terminal window on my encrypted desktop and began typing. My fingers flew across the keyboard in a relentless, percussive rhythm. I bypassed the standard commercial banking portal entirely, using my active federal clearance credentials. I initiated a military-grade diagnostic trace directly into the Vanguard Apex internal network. The screen transitioned into a cascading waterfall of green, encrypted data blocks. Vanguard Apex utilized a standard, expensive corporate security architecture designed to keep out curious journalists and low-level hackers. It was completely unequipped to handle a targeted, surgical strike from a system architected by the federal government. I deployed a mirror algorithm. It was a highly specialized piece of tracking code designed to latch onto the exact Internet Protocol address Marcus had just used to issue his freeze command. The software burrowed backward through his defense protocols, slicing through his digital barriers like a scalpel through tissue paper. It wrote his own administrative footprint right back to his high-rise executive suite. The progress bar on my screen filled rapidly. Within 45 seconds, the algorithm successfully bypassed his administrative block. A green confirmation banner flashed across my display. My personal checking and savings accounts were instantly unfrozen, restoring my financial baseline and stripping him of his leverage. But I did not disconnect. I kept the secure tunnel wide open, anchoring my system deep inside the $45 million offshore ledger. I watched the raw data populate across my screen. The staggering sum was divided into dozens of complex, interlocking holding cells, shielded by layers of international privacy laws. But my tracking software immediately flagged a glaring anomaly. A bright yellow indicator pulsed rapidly near the bottom of the active ledger. It was a pending outbound transaction. Marcus was severely panicking. In his desperate attempt to secure Elias's hidden fortune following our phone call, he had authorized a massive outgoing wire transfer. He was actively trying to move a substantial piece of the capital out of the centralized trust, hoping to hide it before I could fully map the account. I highlighted the pending transaction and isolated the routing metadata. The amount was mathematically staggering: $500,000. The funds were currently sitting in a digital transit void, queued to clear the International Clearinghouse within the next hour. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes scanning the recipient details. This was not a standard transfer to a corporate holding firm or a secondary offshore bank. The receiving account was entirely domestic, tied to a commercial business operating in the United States. I engaged my forensic database to cross-reference the recipient routing numbers. The software chewed through the data, matching the corporate entity to a registered public license. The results flashed on the screen, revealing the beneficiary in crisp white text: Chloe, a luxury real estate broker based out of a premier agency in Miami, Florida. My jaw tightened. A sharp, heavy thud echoed against my ribs, but my hands remained perfectly steady on the keyboard. I stared at the name, ruthlessly breaking down the logistical variables of the transaction. For 5 agonizing months, I had mourned a man who constantly complained about the cost of our weekly groceries. Elias had monitored our utility bills with an obsessive, suffocating strictness, forcing me to cover our financial shortfalls with my own exhausting overtime hours. He claimed we were absolutely destitute, surviving on his pathetic $800 a month salary. Yet, here was a $500,000 wire transfer being actively dispatched from his hidden offshore fortune directly to a luxury real estate broker in a sun-drenched coastal city. I opened a secondary browser window and ran a deep background search on Chloe. Her professional portfolio loaded instantly on my screen. She specialized exclusively in high-end waterfront properties, catering to international buyers and ultra-wealthy domestic clients looking for absolute privacy. Her latest listings featured sprawling, multi-million-dollar estates with private docks, heavy security gates, and sweeping views of the Atlantic Ocean. I stared at the digital receipt glowing on my monitor. The icy realization settled deep into my bones, freezing whatever lingering grief I had left from my deceased husband. Elias did not just fake his death to escape the suffocating burden of our $2,500 mortgage. He had not drowned in the freezing waters of Lake Michigan to simply escape poverty. He faked his death to buy a sprawling waterfront estate with stolen money. He faked his death to start a brand new life with a brand new woman. The betrayal was absolute, but the grief was already entirely gone. I reached into my leather duffel bag, pulling out my encrypted hard drive, and copied the wire transfer logs, the routing numbers, and Chloe's real estate credentials. Marcus believed he had successfully intimidated me into silence. He believed his offshore fortress was completely secure. He had absolutely no idea that his desperate, panicked transaction had just handed me the exact geographic coordinates of a dead man. I closed the encrypted laptop screen and slid the device back into my heavy leather duffel bag. The following evening, the icy Chicago wind was completely shut out by the heavy, velvet-lined doors of the Gold Coast Heritage Hotel. I stood silently in the deep shadows near the rear exit of the grand ballroom, maintaining a rigid, perfectly straight posture. The space was a sprawling, opulent theater designed to project extreme wealth. Cascading crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant, glittering light over towering white floral centerpieces. Hundreds of elite corporate guests mingled effortlessly, clutching crystal champagne flutes and wearing bespoke formal attire. I was not formally invited to this high society charity dinner. I had simply bypassed the distracted valet staff, walking purposefully through the service corridor utilized by the catering team. My eyes locked onto the brightly illuminated mahogany podium situated at the very front of the massive room. Vivian stood directly under the blinding spotlights, wearing a custom black silk morning gown that easily cost 3 months of my former salary. She gripped the edges of the polished wooden podium, deliberately dabbing the corners of her eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief. "My son gave everything to this community," Vivian whispered into the microphone, her voice trembling with a flawless, manufactured grief. The audience of wealthy donors fell completely silent, entirely captivated by her tragic performance. Elias lived a humble, impoverished life so others could thrive, Vivian continued, looking out over the silent crowd. My jaw tightened. A sharp, heavy thud echoed against my ribs, but my hands remained perfectly still at my sides for 5 agonizing months. I had drowned under the suffocating weight of his fabricated debts. I had worked grueling 80-hour weeks just to prevent the foreclosure of our modest home, all while Vivian constantly begged me to cover her grocery bills. Now, she was aggressively leveraging his fake death to launch a memorial scholarship, actively soliciting hundreds of thousands of dollars in charitable donations to secretly fund her own lavish lifestyle. I stepped slightly deeper into the shadows, surveying the tables situated directly beneath the stage. That was when I saw her. Chloe sat at the most exclusive VIP table in the room, positioned front and center. The luxury real estate broker from Miami did not look like a woman mourning a deceased client. She wore a plunging crimson evening gown, her blonde hair styled in flawless, cascading waves, but it was the jewelry resting heavily against her collarbone that completely anchored my analytical focus. A massive, brilliant-cut diamond pendant hung from a thick platinum chain around her neck. The stone caught the harsh glare of the chandeliers, refracting a blinding, arrogant light across the white linen tablecloth. In the world of high-level asset tracking, a diamond of that specific clarity and weight is never just a piece of jewelry. It is a highly registered, heavily insured, easily traceable physical asset. That single necklace was worth a minimum of $50,000. Chloe took a slow, delicate sip of her champagne, her gaze wandering lazily toward the back of the room. Her eyes scanned past the busy waitstaff, drifting over the shadowed archways, before locking directly onto me. Her glossy lips immediately curled into a sharp, predatory smile. She recognized me instantly. Vivian had undoubtedly shown her photographs of the naive, exhausted wife Elias had left behind in Chicago. Chloe set her crystal flute down onto the table. She stood up, smoothing the front of her crimson gown, and began walking purposefully through the maze of occupied chairs. She did not attempt to be discreet. She moved with the aggressive, entitled strut of a woman who firmly believed she held absolute power over her environment. I did not retreat back into the service corridor. I stood my ground, planting my feet firmly into the thick carpet, waiting patiently for the mistress to make her opening move. Chloe stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me, bringing a suffocating cloud of heavy, expensive perfume directly into my personal space. She looked me up and down, her eyes traveling critically from the sensible hem of my dark trench coat to the faint, exhausted circles under my eyes. She let out a soft, theatrical sigh of deep pity. "You really should not be here, Layla," Chloe stated loudly, ensuring the wealthy guests seated at the adjacent tables could hear her every word. I held her gaze. keeping my breathing locked in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I did not offer her a polite greeting or demand to know how she recognized my face. "Vivian told me about your terrible financial struggles," Chloe continued, her voice deliberately rising in volume to attract a larger audience. Several guests turned their heads, their eyes darting curiously toward the shadows where we stood. Chloe unclasped a small, diamond-encrusted clutch purse and reached inside. She pulled out a crisp, pre-written paper check, pinching it securely between her manicured fingers. She held the slip of paper out toward my chest, offering it like a piece of rotting meat to a starving stray dog. "Take this $500 sympathy check," Chloe commanded, tilting her chin upward with extreme condescension. I looked down at the physical check hovering just inches from my trench coat. "Buy yourself a decent meal and go home," Chloe sneered, her lips twisting into a vicious, triumphant smirk. Elias could barely afford to support himself, let alone a delusional widow. My chest tightened with a sudden, violent surge of indignation, the absolute sheer audacity of the woman who had helped my husband fake his death and steal $45 million, now offering me a $500 handout, was truly staggering. My hands clenched into tight fists inside the deep pockets of my coat. My fingernails dug painfully into my own palms, grounding my focus entirely through the sharp, physical sting. I did not slap the check out of her hand. I did not raise my voice, hurl insults, or desperately try to explain to the staring crowd that she was sleeping with a man who was very much alive. Screaming the truth at a room full of elite strangers would only make me look exactly like the unstable, delusional woman they were trying to portray. Instead, I slowly released the tension in my hands. I withdrew my right hand from my pocket, pulling out my heavy, encrypted cellular device. I raised the phone, pointing the dual-lens camera directly at her chest. "What are you doing?" Chloe demanded, her arrogant smile faltering slightly as she pulled the check back toward her body. I did not answer her. I engaged the high-definition macro lens function on the screen. I leveled the device perfectly and pressed the capture button. The silent shutter snapped a rapid succession of microscopic, ultra-clear images. I did not photograph her face. I focused the lens entirely on the $50,000 diamond pendant resting against her collarbone. Chloe instinctively brought a hand up to her chest, covering the large diamond, her eyes flashing with sudden, defensive confusion. "Are you taking pictures of me?" Chloe asked, taking a nervous half-step backward. I lowered the phone and slid it smoothly back into my coat pocket. I offered her a chilling, empty smile that contained absolutely zero human warmth. "I just admire the craftsmanship," I replied quietly, my voice a flat, mechanical whisper. Chloe stared at me, deeply unnerved by my absolute lack of emotional reaction. She had expected a tearful breakdown, a shouting match, or a humiliating retreat out the rear doors. She had absolutely no idea how to process a woman who simply cataloged her jewelry in dead silence. "You are completely unhinged," Chloe scoffed, attempting to recover her arrogant, dominant posture. She shoved the $500 check aggressively back into her diamond-encrusted clutch. She turned her back on me, flipping her blonde waves over her shoulder, and marched briskly back toward the brightly lit VIP tables. She quickly leaned in to whisper something to Vivian, and both women turned to glare at the shadows where I was standing. I did not wait for the hotel security team to arrive. I turned around and pushed through the heavy velvet doors, stepping back out into the freezing Chicago night. The icy wind immediately bit into my cheeks, but I barely registered the dropping temperature. I walked rapidly down the dark pavement, pulling my phone from my pocket. I opened the encrypted photo gallery, zooming in heavily on the ultra-high-resolution image I had just captured. The macro lens had performed flawlessly. There, stamped cleanly onto the side of the thick platinum clasp, was a tiny, 10-digit alphanumeric serial code. As a senior anti-money laundering investigator, I spent my entire career tracking down heavily guarded offshore assets. Amateurs like Elias and Chloe firmly believed that routing stolen funds through international shell companies provided absolute invisibility. They completely failed to understand that physical luxury goods are the absolute weakest link in any financial concealment strategy. When you purchase a flawless, high-carat diamond from a premier luxury jeweler. The transaction generates a massive digital footprint. International anti-conflict regulations require every single stone of that magnitude to be laser engraved with a microscopic serial number directly onto the platinum clasp or the girdle of the diamond itself. The jeweler is legally mandated to maintain a secure, comprehensive database linking that specific serial number to the exact date of purchase, the primary buyer's identity, and the precise routing numbers of the wire transfer used to fund it. My mind rapidly crunched the logistical variables as I walked toward the train station. High-end jewelers do not simply hand a $50,000 diamond over a glass counter. Their strict insurance protocols mandate that pieces of this magnitude be delivered via an armed, bonded courier to a verified, static location. Tomorrow morning, I would run that exact serial code through the secure federal asset tracking database. The system would instantly identify the specific jeweler, cross-referencing the internal sales ledgers against the $500,000 offshore wire transfer I had intercepted from Marcus's bank. The database match would instantly provide the precise delivery manifest. It would pull back the curtain on the entire operation, identifying the exact luxury address or private marina where the jewelry was securely transported just 48 hours ago. I stopped at the corner of the street and looked back through the towering glass windows of the Gold Coast Heritage Hotel. I could clearly see Chloe taking her seat at the VIP table. She was smiling brightly, laughing as she recounted our brief interaction to the wealthy donors around her. She firmly believed she had successfully humiliated a helpless, destitute widow. She felt entirely untouchable, wrapped in the glamorous illusion funded by stolen marital assets. Chloe took another slow sip of her vintage champagne, completely unaware that her insatiable vanity had just bypassed Marcus's multi-million-dollar corporate firewall entirely. She had absolutely no idea she had just handed me the exact geographical coordinates to a dead man. The morning sun had barely crested the Chicago skyline when I connected my encrypted laptop to the secure federal terminal. I sat at the small wooden table in my hotel room, typing the 10-digit alphanumeric serial code from Chloe's diamond clasp into the primary search bar. The database processed the request with a low, steady hum, cross-referencing global insurance ledgers and high-value transport manifests. The digital query tore through the international privacy walls, tracing the $500,000 wire transfer directly to a premier jeweler in Geneva. The screen flashed green. A secure delivery manifest populated the display in crisp white text. The $50,000 necklace had been transported via an armed, bonded courier just 48 hours ago. The final delivery destination was not a corporate office or a high-rise condominium. The manifest listed the specific geographic coordinates of an ultra-exclusive private marina located in Miami, Florida. I did not hesitate or waste time congratulating myself on the breach. I closed the laptop, slid it into my heavy leather duffel bag, and booked a first-class ticket on the next outbound flight to the coast, paying entirely in cash to ensure my movements remained completely off the grid. The oppressive, suffocating heat of South Florida slammed into me the exact moment I stepped out of the air-conditioned airport terminal. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of salt water, a stark contrast to the freezing winds of Chicago. I bypassed the chaotic crowds of tourists and hailed a private black car. I handed the driver a folded $50 bill and read him the coordinates from the courier manifest. We drove down a winding coastal highway, leaving the crowded public beaches far behind. The landscape shifted rapidly, transforming into a heavily fortified sector of the coastline reserved exclusively for billionaires and international tycoons. The car dropped me off a half-mile away from the marina gates, leaving me standing on the shoulder of the sun-baked asphalt. I walked the rest of the way, keeping my head down, utilizing the dense line of towering palm trees along the perimeter fence to break my silhouette. The marina was a massive fortress of pristine white concrete, wrought iron, and heavily reinforced steel gates. High-definition security cameras swept every conceivable angle of the main entrance, constantly monitoring the arrival of luxury vehicles. I did not attempt to bluff my way past the armed guards stationed in the air-conditioned security kiosk during my flight. I had routed a connection through the municipal utility network, extracting a localized maintenance access code used by the private sanitation crews. I slipped down a narrow concrete embankment, bypassing the primary sightlines, and approached a secondary service gate covered in overgrown bougainvillea vines. I punched the 6-digit code into the rusted keypad. The heavy iron gate clicked open with a quiet metallic thud. I stepped through the threshold and infiltrated the private docks. The water in the protected harbor was a brilliant, unnatural shade of turquoise, reflecting the blinding midday sun with an almost violent intensity. Massive, multi-deck yachts lined the extensive wooden slips, floating palaces of polished fiberglass, tinted bulletproof glass, and gleaming chrome. I moved silently down the main boardwalk, staying tight against the corrugated metal siding of a towering boat storage warehouse to completely conceal my presence in the deep, geometric shadows. I navigated the maze of docks until I reached the specific slip indicated on the jeweler's manifest. I stopped moving entirely, pressing my back flat against the sun-warmed metal wall of the warehouse. A sprawling 3-deck luxury yacht was slowly reversing into the slip. The vessel was a breathtaking masterpiece of marine engineering, easily worth $10 million. The heavy twin diesel engines rumbled with a deep, vibrating power that shook the wooden planks beneath my boots. The captain, perched high in the enclosed bridge, brought the massive ship to a flawless, gentle halt against the thick rubber bumpers lining the dock. The hydraulic sideboarding ramp lowered smoothly, hitting the wood with a solid, echoing thud. Footsteps clattered against the aluminum ramp. A woman walked down first, wearing a flowing white sundress that caught the ocean breeze. The $50,000 diamond pendant rested heavily against her collarbone, glittering arrogantly in the sunlight. Chloe laughed brightly, tossing her perfectly styled blonde waves over her shoulder, completely at ease in her stolen paradise. Then, the dead man stepped out into the blistering sunlight. Elias did not look like a man who had suffered a catastrophic drowning in the freezing, dark waters of Lake Michigan. His skin was deeply tanned, glowing with the careless health of a man who spent his days lounging on the deck of a multi-million-dollar vessel. He wore crisp, perfectly pressed white linen trousers and a tailored silk shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest. He carried a heavy silver bucket filled with crushed ice and a magnum bottle of vintage champagne that cost at least $1,000. My chest tightened violently. A sharp, suffocating pressure clamped down hard on my ribs, forcing all the oxygen from my lungs. My pulse hammered against my eardrums with a deafening, frantic rhythm. I stared at the man holding the silver bucket. This was the exact same man who had claimed his part-time data entry job barely covered our utility bills. This was the man who had monitored our weekly grocery budget with an obsessive, suffocating strictness, forcing me to work grueling 80-hour weeks just to prevent the bank from foreclosing on our modest Chicago condo. Now, he was standing on a private sun-drenched dock, popping the cork on a $1,000 bottle of champagne, pouring the foaming golden liquid into 2 crystal flutes while laughing with his mistress. The absolute staggering scale of the psychological injustice threatened to crack my composure entirely. I crushed the physiological reaction instantly. I forced my jaw to unhinge, grinding my back teeth together to reestablish my physical grounding. I pulled a slow, measured breath in through my nose, regulating the violent spike in my blood pressure. I did not step out of the shadows. I did not scream his name, demand an explanation, or charge down the wooden dock to shatter his crystal champagne flutes. Screaming at a ghost achieves absolutely nothing. I needed to document the phantom. I reached into the deep main compartment of my leather duffel bag and pulled out a heavy digital camera equipped with a high-powered, military-grade telephoto lens. The equipment weighed nearly 4 pounds, but my hands were completely steady. I rested the heavy black barrel of the lens against the sharp corner of the metal warehouse, utilizing the architecture to perfectly stabilize my shot. I adjusted the manual focus ring, zooming past the splashing champagne and the laughing mistress. I locked the digital crosshairs directly onto the side of the yacht's pristine white hull. I held my breath and pressed the shutter button. The mechanical click was entirely silent. I snapped 3 rapid ultra-high-resolution images of the alphanumeric registration numbers painted across the fiberglass. I shifted the heavy lens upward, tracking the movement on the dock. I zoomed in heavily on Elias's face, waiting for the perfect angle. He turned toward Chloe, smiling widely, exposing his profile to the harsh Florida sun. I captured a flawless, unobstructed, high-definition photograph of his facial structure, documenting the exact contours of the man who had faked his own death. I lowered the camera, sliding it smoothly back into my duffel bag. I pulled my encrypted cellular device from my pocket and linked it directly to the camera's internal storage via a secure short-range connection. I extracted the hull registration numbers and uploaded the data packet directly into the active Federal Maritime Database. My Level 6 federal clearance bypassed the standard public inquiry restrictions instantly. The system locked onto the registration, matching the luxury vessel to a corporate holding company. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard, deploying an algorithm to peel back the heavy layers of international corporate camouflage, forcing the system to reveal the true registered owner of the yacht. The search bar loaded for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, the name flashed across my screen in crisp, undeniable white text: Julian Cross. I opened a secondary terminal window and ran a deep background diagnostic on the specific identity. The results populated almost immediately, bringing a sharp, icy realization to the surface of my skin. Julian Cross was not an active international businessman. He was a wealthy Canadian expatriate who had died of a sudden respiratory failure in a private hospital in Vancouver exactly 3 years ago. Elias had not merely faked his own death to escape our suffocating mortgage. He had actively purchased the stolen identity of a deceased foreigner, utilizing Julian Cross's pristine, empty digital footprint to completely reinvent himself on paper. I dug deeper into the financial architecture attached to the stolen Canadian identity. The true scope of Elias's impending maneuver materialized on my screen, highlighting a massive, catastrophic vulnerability in his plan. Julian Cross was scheduled to formally inherit the $45 million offshore trust through an elaborate, finalized corporate merger. The digital paperwork had already been processed through Vanguard Apex Financial. The funds were currently sitting in escrow, waiting for the final legal execution. The timeline glowed red on my encrypted display. The inheritance was set to clear in exactly 48 hours. Elias was just 2 days away from legally securing the stolen fortune under a completely untouchable alias. Once the merger finalized, the $45 million would instantly scatter across a dozen untraceable international accounts, and the man I had married would vanish into the wind forever. The heavy twin diesel engines of the yacht suddenly roared back to life, breaking the quiet ambiance of the exclusive marina. I looked up from my screen. Elias had finished his glass of champagne. He tossed the empty crystal flute to a waiting deckhand and escorted Chloe back up the aluminum boarding ramp. The ramp retracted with a sharp hiss. I remained perfectly still in the dark, suffocating shadows of the metal warehouse. I watched the massive, multi-million-dollar vessel pull away from the dock, churning the turquoise water into a violent white wake as it navigated toward the open ocean. A cold, hollow smile spread slowly across my face. Elias was standing on the top deck of his yacht, staring out at the horizon, believing he was sailing straight toward absolute untouchable financial freedom. He felt completely secure in his stolen paradise. He had absolutely no idea that the wife he had left behind in Chicago was currently standing in the shadows of his own marina, quietly preparing to sink his entire new existence to the bottom of the ocean. I retreated from the blistering heat of the private marina, navigating the winding coastal highway back to my obscure Miami hotel. The humid saltwater breeze faded the instant I pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors, stepping into the chilled, sterile air of the lobby. A concierge in a crisp gray suit stepped directly into my path. He held out a thick, sealed manila envelope bearing the bright red stamp of an expedited legal courier service. The sender block listed a prominent Cook County law firm. My jaw tightened. I reached out, took the heavy package without a word of thanks, and carried it up to my room. I dropped the envelope onto the small glass desk near the window. I did not throw my coat onto the bed or kick off my shoes. I reached into my pocket, withdrew a silver letter opener, and sliced through the reinforced paper tape. a massive stack of dense legal and financial documents slid out, accompanied by an official, watermarked notice from the Internal Revenue Service. My eyes scanned the bold print at the top of the heavy parchment. It was a formal declaration of posthumous marital debt transfer. Elias had not just faked his death to escape our $2,500 mortgage. He had spent his final weeks in Chicago legally tying his shadow liabilities to my personal Social Security number. The numbers printed on the penalty notice were staggering: $2 million in delinquent corporate taxes and fraudulent vendor penalties were now officially registered under my name. The attached legal briefing stated that, because I was the surviving spouse, the creditors had successfully petitioned the probate court to seize all my remaining marital assets. A secondary clause indicated a pending federal arrest warrant for gross tax evasion if the massive balance was not settled within 14 days. Elias and Marcus were actively coordinating their attacks. The corrupt banker had clearly warned my ghost of a husband about my digital intrusion into the Vanguard Apex financial network. They wanted to neutralize me before I could expose the $45 million trust. They intended to drown me in fabricated debt, ensuring I would be locked in a federal holding cell long before Julian Cross finalized his corporate merger. I stared at the staggering $2 million penalty resting on the glass desk. A sharp, localized pressure built behind my temples. My breathing slowed into a deliberate, measured rhythm. I did not pull out my phone to beg a defense lawyer for a consultation. I did not collapse onto the hotel mattress and weep over the sheer injustice of a dead man destroying my future. I pushed the heavy hotel chair back and sat down. I placed my hands flat against the cool glass surface and slowly cracked my knuckles. The sharp pops echoed in the quiet room. I reached into my leather duffel bag, retrieved my encrypted laptop, and flipped the screen open. The glow of the monitor cast a pale white light across the scattered legal documents. I launched my secure virtual private network, routing my digital footprint through a labyrinth of international servers to mask my Miami location. I needed to dissect the exact anatomy of this toxic debt dump. As a senior anti-money laundering investigator, my primary expertise involved dismantling complex corporate tax structures. Amateurs always assume that filing legal paperwork makes a liability legitimate. They fail to realize that every single debt carries a traceable genetic code. I typed the federal tax identification numbers listed on the penalty notice into my forensic auditing software. The algorithm chewed through the data, pulling the public registration records for the holding companies Elias had used to generate the $2 million in fraudulent losses. The screen populated with a messy, tangled web of limited liability corporations registered in Delaware and Nevada. My fingers established a relentless, percussive rhythm against the keyboard. I peeled back the corporate layers one by one. Elias had acted as a shadow chief financial officer for these entities, fabricating operational expenses to wash dirty capital. I scanned the itemized deductions. He had claimed hundreds of thousands of dollars in fictitious consulting fees and non-existent supply chain logistics, but his methodology was remarkably sloppy. He had used the exact same registered agent for 6 different shell companies and routed the fabricated losses through a singular commercial clearinghouse. He lacked the sophisticated discipline required to maintain a watertight corporate veil. I downloaded the localized tax filings. Isolating the specific dates, Elias had transferred the fraudulent liabilities into our joint marital trust. The timestamps confirmed he had executed the legal maneuvers just 3 days before his staged boating accident on Lake Michigan. He had orchestrated my financial ruin while sleeping in our shared bed. My phone vibrated harshly against the glass desk, rattling the metal frame. The caller identification displayed a restricted Chicago number. I knew exactly who was calling to gloat over my impending arrest. I pressed the answer button and raised the cold device to my ear. "You received the courier package," Marcus stated. His tone was thick with arrogant satisfaction. The wealth manager spoke slowly, savoring his perceived victory over a helpless widow. "I warned you to step away from the accounts, Layla," Marcus continued, his breathing heavy through the receiver. "You are now carrying $2 million in federal tax liabilities. If you ever try to access Vanguard Apex Financial again, I will personally forward your location to the authorities." I kept my eyes locked on the cascading data streams illuminating my monitor. I reached for a glass of water, taking a slow, steady sip. The cool liquid grounded me, keeping my focus razor sharp. "You are a very sloppy architect, Marcus," I replied evenly. "Excuse me," Marcus sneered, his voice raising a fraction. "You should never sign your own work," I whispered. I pressed the end call button and placed the phone face down on the desk. I did not give him the opportunity to argue or demand an explanation. His threat was built on a fragile foundation of sand, and I had just located the ocean. I turned my singular focus back to the auditing software. The $2 million in toxic debt had to originate from a centralized parent company before Elias distributed it into the shell corporations. I ran a targeted diagnostic and the clearinghouse routing numbers. The progress bar stretched across my screen, matching the encrypted data against global corporate registries. The software hit a verified match. The screen flashed green, displaying the parent entity responsible for underwriting the initial fraudulent loans. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the crisp white text. The parent company was not an obscure offshore entity. It was a domestic commercial credit subsidiary directly owned and operated by Vanguard Apex Financial. My jaw tightened. A cold, hollow realization settled deep into my bones. Elias had not acted alone in dumping this toxic debt onto my name. He did not possess the administrative clearance to underwrite a $2 million commercial liability on his own. Marcus had personally authorized the internal credit transfer. The corrupt banker had weaponized his own institution's subsidiary to generate the fake debt, attempting to use the Internal Revenue Service as his personal attack dog. I exported the direct links connecting Vanguard Apex Financial to the fraudulent Delaware shell companies. I secured the entire data packet onto my encrypted hard drive, locking the undeniable proof of massive federal fraud behind military-grade encryption. Marcus had just handed me the internal ledgers of his corrupt banking network. He had violated the most fundamental rule of money laundering by commingling his clean corporate assets with Elias's dirty shadow liabilities. The evidence was undeniable. Marcus was actively facilitating wire fraud, tax evasion, and corporate embezzlement on a federal scale. If I submitted this single digital packet to the Securities and Exchange Commission, Vanguard Apex Financial would be raided by armed agents before sunrise. I gathered the physical notices and stacked them neatly on the corner of the glass desk. The threat of an arrest warrant meant nothing to a woman holding the keys to the kingdom. Elias and Marcus truly thought this $2 million debt would act as a heavy anchor, dragging me down into a suffocating abyss of legal panic and federal prison. They failed to realize I had just forged their anchor into a lethal spear, and I was aiming it directly at the banker's chest. The silence of the Miami hotel room was abruptly shattered by a heavy, percussive pounding against my door. The knocks were rapid and aggressive, vibrating the brass fixtures. I did not jump. I kept my hands resting evenly on the cool glass surface of the desk. I stood up, smoothing the front of my dark trousers, and walked deliberately toward the entryway. I pressed my eye against the small glass peephole. Two heavily built men stood in the corridor. They did not wear the crisp uniforms of the hotel staff. They wore dark, off-the-rack suits stretched tight over thick shoulders. Their posture was rigid, exuding the distinct aggressive aura of private security contractors operating entirely off the books. Marcus was escalating his timeline, having failed to paralyze me with fabricated debt. The corrupt wealth manager was now deploying physical intimidation. I reached forward and disengaged the deadbolt. The metal lock clicked sharply. Before I could even reach for the handle, the heavy wooden door was violently pushed open from the outside. The sudden force required me to take a single step backward to maintain my balance. The two men marched into my room, bringing the smell of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cologne into the sterile, air-conditioned space. The taller contractor immediately turned and slammed the door shut, securing the deadbolt behind him. He stepped in front of the exit, crossing his thick arms, effectively sealing me inside. The second man walked directly into the center of the room. He did not offer a polite greeting. He reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder, tossing it carelessly onto the glass desk right next to my stacked tax notices. The heavy folder landed with a dull thud. "Sit down and listen carefully," the man commanded, his voice a low, gravelly threat. I remained standing. I did not reach for my cellular phone to dial emergency services. I simply adjusted the cuffs of my blouse and held his gaze. My pulse maintained a slow, perfectly regulated rhythm. "You are trespassing," I stated evenly, keeping my tone devoid of any alarm. The contractor ignored my statement. He flipped the leather-bound folder open, revealing a stack of dense legal documents. A crisp cashier check rested on top of the paperwork. "Marcus is a very generous man," the contractor sneered, tapping his thick finger against the paper check. I lowered my eyes to examine the financial instrument. The amount was printed in bold black ink, $10,000. It was an insulting, pathetic sum designed to look like a lifeline to a desperate, bankrupt widow. I shifted my gaze to the legal document positioned directly beneath the check. The header explicitly outlined a comprehensive, non-disclosure agreement paired with an absolute waiver of all surviving spousal rights to the estate of Elias. "Sign the waiver," the man ordered, pulling a silver pen from his pocket and holding it out toward my chest. I did not take the pen. I analyzed the crude, desperate mechanics of their strategy. Marcus firmly believed the $2 million toxic debt had successfully crushed my spirit. He assumed I was currently sitting in this hotel room, paralyzed by the fear of federal tax evasion charges, desperately looking for an exit strategy. He dispatched these thugs to offer me $10,000 in exchange for permanently relinquishing my claim to the $45 million offshore trust. He wanted to buy his absolute safety with a handful of loose change. "Take the money and disappear," the contractor added, taking an aggressive step into my personal space. I looked at the heavy silver pen hovering inches from my collarbone. Then, I looked directly into his eyes. I did not plead for my physical safety. I did not attempt to negotiate a higher settlement. I simply turned my back on him and walked toward my leather briefcase resting on the edge of the bed. The man let out a sharp, irritated scoff, clearly assuming I was retreating to find my own pen or a tissue to wipe away non-existent tears. I opened the brass clasps of my briefcase. The metallic clicks echoed sharply in the quiet room. I reached past my encrypted laptop and withdrew a thick stack of printed forensic auditing logs. I had physically documented the exact routing numbers, timestamps, and internal server footprints linking Marcus to the fraudulent shell companies before disconnecting my virtual private network. I turned around and walked back to the glass desk. I dropped the heavy stack of printed evidence directly on top of their pathetic $10,000 check. "I am not signing your waiver," I whispered, sliding the documents closer to his hands. The contractor frowned, his aggressive posture faltering slightly in the face of my absolute compliance. He looked down at the top page of my forensic logs. His eyes scanned the cascading rows of highlighted offshore routing numbers and the specific corporate tax identifiers tied directly to Vanguard Apex Financial. "What is this garbage?" he demanded, his voice losing a fraction of its commanding bass. "That is a heavily documented trail of federal wire fraud," I replied calmly, leaning forward until my hands rested flat against the glass desk. "And by bringing me this extortion contract across state lines, you have just officially entered the conspiracy." The man guarding the door shifted his weight uncomfortably, the leather of his shoes squeaking against the polished floor. The lead contractor stared at me, his thick brow furrowing as his brain struggled to process my lack of fear. "You are currently acting as unlicensed accomplices to a massive corporate embezzlement operation," I continued, reciting the statutes with the icy, mechanical precision of a senior federal asset. "The documents you just placed on my desk constitute active blackmail in a federal racketeering investigation. That carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary." The lead contractor took a slow, hesitant half-step backward. The arrogant sneer completely vanished from his face. He looked at the printed logs, then looked back at my face, finally recognizing the dangerous, lethal authority radiating from my posture. He had been hired to bully a helpless, grieving widow. He was entirely unequipped to interrogate a senior anti-money laundering investigator holding military-grade financial intelligence. "Marcus lied to you," I stated coldly, picking up his silver pen and tossing it onto the floor at his feet. "He sent you here to absorb the federal liability for his stolen $45 million. If you are still standing in my hotel room in exactly 30 seconds, I will personally add your names to the federal indictment." The silence in the room became incredibly heavy. The two men exchanged a rapid, panicked glance. They were hired muscle, paid to intimidate civilians, not to tangle with federal authorities over multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. The lead contractor did not attempt to argue. He did not reach for the $10,000 check or the non-disclosure agreement. He simply backed away from the desk, leaving the extortion materials behind. He turned and nodded sharply to the man guarding the door. The second contractor immediately disengaged the deadbolt and pulled the heavy wooden door open. They rushed out into the corridor, their heavy footsteps echoing loudly against the carpet as they sprinted toward the elevators. The door swung shut, the latch clicking securely into place. I was entirely alone again. I did not let out a sigh of relief. I reached down, retrieved their silver pen from the carpet, and tossed it into the trash can. I walked back to my briefcase and pulled out my encrypted laptop, carrying it to the glass desk. The physical confrontation was over, but the digital fallout was about to begin. I flipped the screen open and launched my secure monitoring terminal. My ghost node was still buried deep inside the Vanguard Apex internal banking network. I watched the encrypted data packets flowing across my display. I knew the exact sequence of events currently unfolding. The panicked contractors were dialing Marcus from the hotel lobby, informing the corrupt wealth manager that the grieving widow was actually holding a physical dossier of his federal crimes. The progress bar on my screen suddenly spiked. A massive, chaotic surge of internal banking traffic flooded the Vanguard Apex network. Marcus was reacting. The failure of his physical intimidation tactic had shattered his remaining composure. Knowing I possessed the routing numbers and the shell company identifiers, the banker was actively abandoning his defensive posture. A bright red alert flashed across my tracking software. Marcus was initiating a highly restricted emergency protocol. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the rapidly populating command lines. Marcus was forcefully severing the $45 million trust from the standard corporate ledger. He was attempting to move the entire staggering fortune into a centralized, untouchable, offshore holding cell designed for absolute catastrophic asset protection. This specific type of financial vault required a secondary layer of biometric authentication to execute the final transfer. I watched the destination code lock into place on my screen. Marcus was moving all the stolen capital into a single, highly vulnerable bottleneck. He thought he was locking the funds away behind an impenetrable wall to protect himself from my investigation. I closed my laptop, perfectly satisfied with the outcome of the morning. Marcus thought he could bully a grieving widow, but he just forced a cornered tiger to bare its teeth. The silence of my Miami hotel room provided the ideal acoustic environment for deep, analytical focus. I stood up from the glass desk and walked toward the small kitchenette to pour a fresh glass of ice water. The condensation beaded against the thin plastic cup, chilling my fingertips. My digital ghost node remained embedded deep inside the Vanguard Apex internal network, silently monitoring the emergency protocol Marcus had just triggered. The corrupt banker was actively attempting to transfer the $45 million fortune into a centralized offshore holding trust. He intended to bury the stolen assets behind a wall of impenetrable international privacy laws. Before I could take a sip of my water, a sharp, piercing alarm emitted from the speakers of my encrypted laptop. It was not a standard banking notification. It was a high-decibel federal security alert. I dropped the plastic cup onto the counter. I crossed the room in 3 long strides and dropped back into the desk chair. I stared at the glowing monitor. A glaring crimson banner pulsed across the top of my primary terminal. Unauthorized biometric access attempt detected. Level 6 clearance compromised. My chest tightened. I placed my hands flat on the desk, forcing a slow, measured breath out through my nose to lower my spiking heart rate. The notification indicated a catastrophic vulnerability. The centralized offshore trust Marcus was utilizing required a secondary, biometric authentication layer to finalize any massive capital transfer. To set up this shadow account months ago, Elias had needed a pristine, federal-grade biometric profile to act as a decoy shield. He had used mine. Now, anchored on his luxury yacht somewhere off the Florida coast, my supposed dead husband was actively attempting to forge my biometric signature to bypass the final security checkpoint. He was utilizing a black market spoofing algorithm to mimic my thumbprint and retinal scans. The federal security architecture did not recognize the forgery as a simple password error. My credentials were tied directly to the Anti-Money Laundering Division of the United States government. The system interpreted his unauthorized ping as a hostile cyber attack against a federal asset. A secondary countdown timer appeared on my screen, ticking down from 60 seconds. If the timer reached 0, my federal credentials would freeze, my level 6 clearance would vanish, I would be locked out of the offshore ledger, and Elias would successfully execute the transfer the moment the lockdown lifted. My encrypted cellular device buzzed against the glass desk. The caller identification displayed Marcus's direct office line. I picked up the phone, pressing the cold glass against my ear. "Your digital footprint is frozen, Layla," Marcus sneered, his voice tight with breathless anticipation. I kept my eyes locked on the countdown timer. It ticked down to 50 seconds. "The biometric lock is sealing the trust as we speak," Marcus continued rapidly. "You lose. You always celebrate before the final audit." "Marcus," I replied evenly, my voice a flat, mechanical whisper. I ended the call and placed the phone face down. Arguing with a pawn wastes precious tactical seconds. The timer read 45 seconds. I did not attempt to cancel the transfer. Canceling would push the funds back into the Vanguard Apex ledger, leaving them under Marcus's control. I needed the transfer to proceed, but I had to alter the destination of the final authority. I cracked my knuckles. My fingers hit the keyboard. Establishing a rapid percussive rhythm, I launched a proprietary Ghost Node application I had personally coded for the federal government. As a senior investigator, my primary expertise involved dismantling elite corporate firewalls from the inside out. I understood the precise structural weaknesses of biometric authentication channels. They require a localized handshake between the requesting Internet Protocol address and the central server. I did not attack the Vanguard Apex server. I attacked Elias's incoming signal. I typed a sequence of override commands, deploying a localized mirroring algorithm. The software burrowed into the active digital tunnel connecting Elias's yacht to the Chicago bank. I isolated his specific Internet Protocol address. The progress bar on my screen filled, turning from crimson to pale blue. I executed a packet sniffing protocol, intercepting his spoofed biometric data, the exact millisecond it entered the network stream. The timer hit 20 seconds. I hijacked the session authentication. I severed Elias's connection to the bank without breaking the overarching digital tunnel. I redirected the verification request away from his offshore location, routing it directly into my own encrypted terminal in the Miami hotel room. The red warning banner on my screen vanished. In its place, a standard, highly secure biometric prompt materialized. The system was no longer asking a hacker on a yacht for a forged signature. It was asking the true, living owner of the profile for physical confirmation. I stared at the glowing prompt. A cold, hollow sensation settled deep into my bones. Elias had built his entire criminal empire on the assumption that I was a naive, disposable decoy. He had leveraged my immaculate federal record to hide his $45 million theft, fully expecting to discard me the moment he secured his new identity. He truly believed he was the apex predator of this financial ecosystem. I reached out and pressed my right thumb firmly against the biometric scanner embedded beneath the glass trackpad of my laptop. The machine hummed softly, reading the microscopic ridges and valleys of my skin. The scanner cross-referenced the physical input against the federal database. The green confirmation light illuminated my face. I engaged the secondary retinal scanner, leaning forward until the camera captured the precise capillary structure of my left eye. The system processed the dual-layer authentication. A bright green banner cascaded down the display. Biometric signature verified. Transfer authorized. I leaned back in the rigid hotel chair, interlacing my fingers in my lap. I did not celebrate. I watched the raw financial data execute the command. The $45 million vanished from the Vanguard Apex corporate holdings cell. The funds flowed smoothly into the centralized, untouchable offshore trust Marcus had specifically designed to be impenetrable. But Marcus had made a fatal architectural error by demanding a biometric lock to finalize the transfer. He had handed the ultimate administrative authority over to the owner of that specific biometric profile. I opened the administrative dashboard for the new centralized trust. I navigated to the user access permissions. 2 names were listed with full executive control: Marcus and the fabricated alias of Julian Cross. I highlighted Marcus's profile. I pressed the delete key. The system prompted me for a secondary confirmation. I verified the deletion, instantly stripping the corrupt wealth manager of his administrative rights. His access was permanently revoked. I highlighted the profile for Julian Cross. My jaw tightened as I stared at the stolen identity Elias had purchased to replace me. I pressed the delete key a second time. The alias vanished from the ledger. I was now the sole exclusive administrator of the $45 million trust. The funds were locked behind a biometric wall that only my physical body could open. Marcus could not reverse the transfer. Elias could not access a single dime. The money was trapped in a digital vault, and I was holding the only key. I closed the administrative dashboard and disconnected my ghost node from the network. The silence in the hotel room felt remarkably heavy, charged with the devastating reality of the shift in power. I reached for my plastic cup, taking a slow, steady sip of the ice water. The cool liquid grounded me in the physical present. Hundreds of miles away, on the deck of a luxury yacht, Elias was likely staring at his computer screen. He was watching the transfer confirmation flash across his display, believing his spoofing algorithm had succeeded. He was celebrating his ultimate victory, pouring expensive champagne and toasting to his new, untouchable life as Julian Cross. He thought he had just secured his stolen fortune. He was oblivious to the fact that his dead wife had just seized total control of his financial empire, and she was preparing to drag him back into the cold, unforgiving light of the real world. My encrypted laptop shut down with a quiet, solid mechanical click. I slid the heavy device into my leather duffel bag and zipped the main compartment closed. The silence of my Miami hotel room provided a temporary sanctuary, but holding the digital keys to the $45 million offshore trust was only the first half of the war. I slung the heavy strap over my shoulder and walked out into the corridor. As I approached the front reception desk to finalize my checkout, a bright flash of color on the mounted television screen caught my attention. A Chicago news channel was broadcasting a syndicated breaking report. A massive, unflattering photograph of my face occupied the left side of the screen. On the right was grainy footage of Elias's supposedly recovered boat wreckage. The bold red ticker scrolling across the bottom explicitly claimed that local authorities were actively investigating the grieving widow for orchestrating a fatal maritime accident to collect a $3 million life insurance payout. Vivian and Chloe had launched a desperate, scorched earth offensive. They had coordinated a vicious media smear campaign, feeding fabricated tips directly to the local police. They intended to completely neutralize my credibility, branding me a murderer before I could expose the living ghost hiding in Miami. Before I could process the sheer audacity of the broadcast, heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed sharply behind me. 3 broadly built men wearing cheap, off-the-rack suits moved rapidly across the lobby, directly intercepting my path to the exit doors. They possessed the rigid, disciplined presence of sworn law enforcement officers. The lead detective stepped directly into my personal space. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, flipping it open to expose a silver police badge alongside a printed transit warrant originating from Cook County. "Layla, you are coming with us right now," the detective commanded, his voice echoing loudly across the quiet lobby. I did not gasp in shock. I did not drop my bag or loudly demand to know my charges. Screaming my innocence in a public space would only make me look exactly like the erratic suspect Vivian had described. I simply tightened my grip on the leather strap and offered the detective a slow, measured nod. I walked out into the blistering Florida sun and slid silently into the cramped back seat of their unmarked cruiser. The interrogation room deep inside the local police precinct was a masterclass in psychological pressure. The walls were painted a dull, sickly gray. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed aggressively overhead, casting long, harsh shadows across a scratched metal table bolted firmly to the concrete floor. I sat perfectly still in the rigid metal chair. I forced my breathing into a steady, rhythmic cadence, maintaining absolute physical control over my spiking adrenaline. The heavy steel door swung open with a loud screech. The lead detective marched into the small room, tossing a thick manila folder directly onto the center of the table. The heavy paper slapped loudly against the steel surface. He dragged the opposing metal chair out, the legs scraping terribly against the concrete, and sat down heavily. "Your mother-in-law provided a very compelling, highly detailed statement this morning," the detective sneered, leaning his thick forearms against the scratched table. I held his aggressive gaze, blinking slowly. "Vivian claims you deliberately sabotaged the navigation equipment on that boat," he continued, raising his voice. "She claims you drowned your own husband to collect the insurance payout." I did not raise my voice to defend my character. I did not weep at the horrific injustice of the accusation. Abstract emotions had absolutely no tactical value in this concrete box. "You are facing first-degree murder charges," the detective pressed, his jaw tightening. "We are processing your extradition back to Cook County today." I reached down to my leather duffel bag resting quietly by my feet. I gripped the heavy brass zipper and pulled it open. The sharp metallic sound cut clearly through the oppressive silence. The detective instinctively shifted his weight, his hand dropping slightly toward his holstered weapon. But I withdrew nothing more dangerous than my encrypted digital tablet. I placed the sleek black device squarely onto the scratched metal table. "You are currently investigating a phantom detective," I stated quietly, my voice a flat, mechanical whisper. I pressed my right thumb firmly against the biometric scanner located at the base of the screen. The device hummed to life, illuminating the dim room with a stark, pale white light. I tapped the glass screen 3 times, launching the highly encrypted media gallery I had compiled just 24 hours ago. I rotated the tablet, sliding it slowly across the metal table until the high-definition display rested directly under his gaze. The detective frowned deeply, dropping his eyes to the glowing screen. The image displayed a crystal-clear, ultra-high-resolution photograph of Elias. He was completely alive, sporting a deep, healthy tan and standing confidently on the polished teak deck of a multi-million-dollar luxury yacht. He was holding a heavy silver bucket filled with crushed ice and pouring a magnum bottle of expensive vintage champagne. The detective stopped breathing. His jaw went entirely slack as he stared at the undeniably vibrant face of the supposedly deceased man. "That specific photograph was captured yesterday afternoon," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly clinical and detached, right here in a private marina in Miami. The detective reached out with a trembling finger and swiped the glass screen. The next image instantly populated the display. It was a zoomed-in, macro-lens capture of the yacht's pristine white hull, clearly displaying the 10-digit alphanumeric registration numbers painted across the fiberglass. "This entire murder investigation is a massive waste of your municipal resources," I whispered, resting my hands flat on the cool metal table. "Explain this to me right now," the detective demanded, his voice entirely stripped of its previous arrogant authority. I leaned slightly forward, closing the physical distance between us across the table. I seamlessly transitioned into my professional role as a senior anti-money laundering investigator. I did not speak like a terrified, grieving widow. I spoke with the icy, undeniable authority of a federal asset delivering a classified tactical briefing. "Elias utilized a heavily bribed medical examiner in Cook County to falsify the autopsy reports," I recited, my words clipping with mechanical, practiced precision. "He intentionally faked his own catastrophic drowning to successfully execute a massive corporate embezzlement scheme." I reached out and swiped the digital tablet to the third file in the encrypted gallery. A cascading wall of complex maritime tracking data populated the display, cross-referenced directly with federal biometric registries. I utilized military-grade facial recognition software to absolutely confirm his identity. I continued smoothly, pointing to the specific data nodes on the screen. The system verified his unique bone structure and retinal spacing with a 99% accuracy rating. He is currently operating under the stolen identity of Julian Cross, a deceased Canadian expatriate. The detective stared silently at the glowing maritime logs. The raw data laid out a perfect, undeniable trail of international fraud and identity theft. The arrogant certainty he had carried into the interrogation room completely evaporated, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming realization of the staggering scale of the crime he had just stumbled into. He stole $45 million from a corporate trust, I stated coldly, tapping the screen one final time to bring up the intercepted wire transfer logs linked to Marcus's bank. And he is currently hiding offshore with the very mistress who helped launch this smear campaign. The detective sat back heavily in his metal chair, running a trembling hand over his graying mustache. The murder investigation had just violently shattered into 1,000 pieces. Vivian and Chloe had intended to use the local police department as a blunt weapon to permanently silence me. They had fed the authorities fabricated evidence, hoping to lock me inside a concrete holding cell while Elias finalized his corporate merger and vanished forever. But by launching this vicious media smear campaign and triggering my sudden arrest, Vivian had committed a catastrophic tactical error. She had forced me into a closed, secure room with sworn law enforcement officers, and she had handed me the absolute perfect opportunity to officially present my military-grade forensic intelligence. The detective stood up from the scratched metal table, picking up my digital tablet with extreme, delicate care. He did not look at me with disdain or suspicion anymore. He looked at me with the cautious, highly guarded respect reserved for a vastly superior predator. "I need to contact the federal authorities immediately," he whispered, his eyes remaining firmly locked onto the glowing screen. "You should invite the Federal Bureau of Investigation to the meeting," I replied evenly, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. "They will be highly interested in auditing his offshore banking network." The detective turned and walked rapidly out of the room, leaving the heavy steel door standing wide open. The localized murder accusation was officially dead. In its place, a massive, multi-agency federal fraud inquiry was rapidly igniting. By attempting to frame me for a fabricated death, Vivian and Chloe had successfully placed immense, unseen pressure directly onto Elias's criminal syndicate. The local police would now coordinate a massive dragnet with federal agents, completely destroying the shadow network Elias relied upon. I remained seated in the rigid metal chair, letting a slow, hollow smile spread across my face. I reached down and closed the heavy brass zipper on my leather duffel bag. Vivian truly thought she was sending me to a maximum security state prison. She had absolutely no idea she had just handed the police a verified, high-definition treasure map leading directly to her son. The heavy steel door of the precinct clicked securely into its reinforced frame, instantly severing the chaotic noise of the local police station. I stood on the sun-baked Miami pavement, heat radiating through my dark boots. My pulse maintained a slow, perfectly regulated rhythm. The local detectives were mobilizing a joint federal task force, actively tearing apart the murder charges Vivian had desperately constructed. But I did not waste a single second celebrating the spectacular collapse of their localized smear campaign. I hailed a passing taxi, paying the driver entirely in cash to keep my transit completely off the grid. I directed him to a sterile corporate business center 3 miles away from the private marina. I bypassed the receptionist, paying a premium to rent a secure, soundproof executive suite by the hour. I stepped inside the air-conditioned room, sliding the glass door shut and engaging the brass deadbolt. I dropped my leather duffel bag onto the polished mahogany conference table. The sharp thud echoed in the perfectly quiet room. I withdrew my encrypted laptop, flipping the screen open and booting the proprietary operating system. The moment the federal firewall disengaged, a yellow warning banner pulsed aggressively across my monitoring terminal. Unauthorized mass liquidation initiated, escrow vault breached. My jaw tightened, a sharp pressure built behind my temples, but I forced my breathing to remain perfectly calm. The federal dragnet I had just unleashed was already generating massive, undeniable shockwaves across the criminal underground. The local authorities were querying the offshore maritime registries, and that unprecedented surveillance had completely spooked the shadow syndicate financing Elias's stolen identity. The Phantom was panicking. I analyzed the cascading digital traffic flooding the centralized offshore trust. Elias was actively attempting to liquidate the entire $45 million. He was abandoning Marcus to the federal authorities. He was abandoning Vivian to the local police. He was leaving Chloe behind to absorb the impending raid. He intended to convert the massive fortune into an untraceable cryptocurrency ledger and flee to a non-extradition country. "You are abandoning your own mother," I whispered to the empty room, my voice a flat, mechanical rasp. The massive withdrawal request glowed brightly on my administrative dashboard. Elias was utilizing a highly sophisticated blockchain tumbling protocol. The algorithm was designed to shatter the $45 million into thousands of microscopic digital fragments, bouncing the currency across a labyrinth of international servers before reconstituting the funds in an anonymous digital wallet. As the exclusive biometric administrator of the centralized trust, I possess the absolute authority to simply press a single key and deny the transaction. I could sever his connection and permanently lock the stolen capital behind my own federal credentials, cutting off his escape route instantly. I removed my hands from the keyboard, staring at the flashing decline button. Rejecting the transfer would simply trap Elias in Miami. He would remain hidden on his $10 million luxury yacht, surrounded by heavily armed private security contractors, fighting a prolonged legal war of attrition from the shadows. I did not want a prolonged war. I wanted a total, devastating execution in broad daylight. I cracked my knuckles. The sharp pops resonated against the glass walls of the executive suite. My fingers established a relentless, percussive rhythm against the mechanical keyboard. I did not block the liquidation request. Instead, I engaged a highly advanced blockchain forensic application I had personally engineered for federal asset recovery operations. I was going to let the ghost attempt to run, but I was going to manipulate the digital terrain directly beneath his feet. I approved the initial departure of the funds from the centralized banking trust. The progress bar on my screen shifted from yellow to a steady, flowing green. I watched the $45 million detach from the Vanguard Apex holdings cell, moving rapidly toward the decentralized cryptocurrency exchange. I did not let the capital reach the tumbling protocol. I aggressively intercepted the digital packets exactly halfway through the transmission tunnel. Utilizing my specialized knowledge of corporate ledger architecture, I coded a complex algorithmic freeze directly into the routing protocol. My fingers flew across the keys, building a digital cage around the moving currency. The software rapidly constructed an artificial smart contract hurdle. It was a highly specialized digital bottleneck designed to perfectly mimic a catastrophic international anti-money laundering flag. The $45 million vanished completely from the offshore trust, but it did not populate into Elias's anonymous cryptocurrency wallet. Instead, I forced the staggering fortune into a digital escrow void, a completely inaccessible holding cell suspended deep within the Vanguard Apex financial network. My chest tightened with a sharp, cold thrill as I watched the transfer progress bar halt violently at exactly 99%. The screen flashed with a hard red error code. The funds were completely trapped in the digital ether. A secondary alert chimed sharply through my laptop speakers. My ghost node, still buried deep inside the Chicago banking servers, intercepted an incoming emergency audio transmission. Elias was bypassing the standard corporate channels, utilizing an encrypted satellite frequency to directly contact Marcus's private executive terminal. I routed the audio feed directly into my specialized earpiece, pressing the small device firmly into my ear canal. "The crypto transfer is completely stalled. Marcus?" Elias hissed, his voice echoing with breathless, unadulterated panic. I closed my eyes, visualizing the dead man pacing the polished teak deck of his yacht, staring in absolute horror at his empty digital wallet. "The exchange is demanding physical verification," Marcus replied, his tone trembling with absolute terror. "Bypass the security protocol immediately," Elias commanded, slamming his hand violently against a hard surface. I cannot bypass a smart contract freeze, Marcus countered rapidly, his breath hitching into a pathetic, ragged wheeze. I tapped the keyboard, pulling up the specific parameters of the artificial hurdle I had just deployed. I had not merely frozen the capital, I had weaponized the international banking regulations directly against them. The smart contract explicitly mandated that to release the $45 million from the digital escrow void, the primary beneficiary must present themselves in person to clear the federal compliance flag. "The syndicate bosses are threatening to sink my vessel," Elias barked, his voice cracking under the crushing, invisible pressure. "Fix the ledger right now. You have to fly back to Chicago," Marcus pleaded, his voice dropping into a desperate, high-pitched whine. "You must sign the release in person." I leaned forward, resting my elbows heavily on the cool mahogany table. The absolute brilliance of the trap was its inescapable, suffocating logic. Elias had spent months meticulously constructing the stolen identity of Julian Cross. He had leveraged millions of dollars to ensure he never had to set foot in the freezing, unforgiving winds of his former life. He firmly believed his physical distance guaranteed his absolute safety. "I cannot return to that city," Elias sneered, his vocal cords tightening with visceral, primal fear. "The local police are already mobilizing a massive dragnet. If you do not sign the physical release documents tomorrow morning, the syndicate will kill us both," Marcus sobbed, completely abandoning his arrogant corporate facade. The audio transmission severed with a sharp, static hiss. I removed the earpiece and set it down onto the polished table. The digital evasion had failed completely. Elias was entirely out of options. His anonymous cryptocurrency wallet remained completely empty. The shadow syndicate that had financed his new identity was actively turning against him, demanding their anticipated return on investment before the federal authorities raided the marina. He was standing on a multi-million-dollar yacht in the blistering Florida sun, completely bankrupt and surrounded by highly lethal, invisible enemies. His meticulously crafted illusion of untouchable wealth had just evaporated into thin air. If he stayed in Miami, the federal dragnet would inevitably sweep his vessel, or the syndicate would execute him for losing their operating capital. His only remaining avenue for survival was to physically retrieve the trapped funds. He had to reclaim the $45 million to pay off his dangerous creditors and purchase his passage to a non-extradition paradise. And the only way to release those funds was to step out of the shadows, board a commercial airplane, and walk directly into the Vanguard Apex Financial Headquarters in downtown Chicago. I opened my encrypted flight application and booked a first-class ticket back to Illinois, departing in exactly 2 hours. I paid for the seat using the pristine, completely untouched federal per diem account tied to my primary security clearance. I did not need to hide my movements or utilize cash anymore. I was no longer the desperate, grieving widow fleeing from a fabricated toxic debt dump. I closed the encrypted laptop, feeling the warm metal casing against my palms, and slid the heavy device back into my leather duffel bag. A slow, hollow smile spread across my face, pulling the muscles of my cheeks into a tight, mechanical expression of absolute victory. The digital cryptocurrency trap had snapped shut with flawless, lethal precision. Elias had spent 5 agonizing months playing the role of a phantom, terrorizing me from the safety of his stolen paradise. He truly believed he could simply liquidate his assets and vanish into the digital ether, leaving me to rot in a maximum security state prison for a murder he fabricated. He had absolutely no idea that the woman he had discarded was currently pulling the strings of his entire financial universe. I stood up, sliding the heavy strap of the duffel bag securely over my shoulder. The pressure of the impending climax was mounting rapidly, but the suffocating anxiety I had carried for months was entirely gone. I walked out of the soundproof corporate meeting room, stepping back into the humid Miami air with the cold, unyielding confidence of a senior federal asset. The ghost was completely out of maneuvers, out of time, and out of money to survive. The dead man was being forced to return to the graveyard, and I would be waiting right by the tombstone. The commercial flight from Miami to Chicago provided exactly 3 hours and 12 minutes of completely uninterrupted, Pressurized isolation. I utilized every single passing second to finalize the complex legal architecture of my digital trap. The freezing, unforgiving wind off Lake Michigan struck my face the exact moment I stepped out of the transit terminal, offering a harsh, biting welcome back to the city where my husband had staged his own tragic demise. I bypassed my modest suburban home entirely, directing my hired transit vehicle straight toward the towering glass and steel monolith of the Vanguard Apex financial headquarters. My pristine, Level 6 federal security clearance granted me absolute, unquestioned access to the corporate facility. I bypassed the bustling main reception desk entirely, stepping into a private executive elevator and manually overriding the standard destination controls to access the highly restricted top floor. The heavy steel doors parted with a soft hiss, revealing a hushed, sterile corridor lined entirely with frosted glass walls. I walked purposefully and directly into the primary executive boardroom. It was a massive, intimidating space dominated by a sprawling, highly polished mahogany table designed explicitly to project untouchable corporate wealth. I took my seat at the very head of the heavy wooden table, positioning my leather duffel bag securely near the heels of my boots. I poured a tall glass of ice water from a heavy crystal pitcher resting on a silver tray. The condensation immediately beaded against the cold glass, chilling my fingertips. I set the glass down onto a dark leather coaster and folded my hands neatly on the polished mahogany surface. I did not pull out my phone to check for updates. I did not pace the length of the long room or nervously practice my impending speech. I simply regulated my breathing, matching the slow, mechanical hum of the central climate control system, and waited patiently for the ghost to materialize. Exactly 42 minutes later, the muffled, chaotic sounds of a severe physical disturbance breached the heavy soundproofing of the corridor. Heavy footsteps pounded aggressively against the hardwood flooring outside. An administrative assistant let out a sharp, panicked gasp. The towering double doors of the boardroom were violently shoved open, the heavy brass handles slamming harshly against the interior walls. Elias stormed aggressively into the room. He was moving with a manic, desperate velocity, completely devoid of the careless, sun-drenched arrogance he had projected on his luxury yacht just yesterday. He wore a rumpled, expensive designer suit, his silk tie hanging loose and crooked around his neck. A thick layer of frantic sweat coated his forehead, making his artificial tan look sickly and uneven under the harsh, fluorescent boardroom lights. "Marcus, release the escrow funds right now," Elias roared, his voice cracking with unadulterated, primal panic. He marched 3 heavy paces into the room, his bloodshot eyes darting frantically toward the dark corner where the corrupt wealth manager usually sat. He completely failed to notice the woman sitting quietly at the head of the table. He was entirely consumed by the blinding terror of his failing cryptocurrency liquidation and the impending wrath of his creditors. "The syndicate is threatening my life." Elias hyperventilated, slamming his closed fist violently against the mahogany surface. I reached calmly beneath the edge of the heavy wooden table and pressed the secondary security button embedded in the corporate console. The heavy electronic deadbolts on the double doors engaged simultaneously with a sharp, heavy, metallic crack. The sudden finalizing sound echoed violently across the sterile boardroom. Elias jumped, his broad shoulders twitching erratically as the exit sealed completely shut behind him. He spun around, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. His panicked gaze swept the length of the long room, finally locking directly onto my face. The complete, sudden absence of oxygen in his lungs was physically visible. His jaw dropped, pulling the skin of his face into a slack, horrified mask. He stared at me as if the polished hardwood floor had just cracked open to reveal the burning center of the earth. He took a stumbling, uncoordinated half-step backward, his expensive leather shoes squeaking sharply against the polished floor. I did not gasp in shock. I did not stand up and scream his name or weep tears of relief at the miraculous sight of my deceased husband walking among the living. I did not demand to know why he had abandoned me to drown under the weight of his fabricated debts. I reached forward, wrapping my steady fingers around the cold glass of ice water. I lifted the rim to my lips and took a slow, measured sip, maintaining absolute, unblinking eye contact. Elias raised a trembling hand, pointing a shaking index finger directly at my chest. "Layla," Elias whispered, his vocal cords nearly paralyzed by sheer terror. I set the glass down perfectly onto the leather coaster. I reached into the deep interior compartment of my leather duffel bag and withdrew two thick, heavily stamped legal folders. I placed them flat against the mahogany wood. I pressed my palms against the heavy cardstock and slid them firmly across the long table. The folders glided smoothly, coming to a precise, calculated halt exactly 3 inches from his trembling hands. "The numbers never lie," I stated coldly, maintaining a flat, mechanical tone. Elias looked down at the folders, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Only the people who write them do," I finished, interlacing my fingers together in my lap. He did not reach for the documents. He instantly recognized the official, embossed seal of the Cook County Medical Examiner stamped onto the top page of the first folder. It was his original, highly falsified death certificate, the very document he had purchased to escape our suffocating mortgage. The second folder displayed the active, irrefutable bankruptcy filings for a deceased Canadian expatriate named Julian Cross. "You died 5 months ago," I recited, keeping my breathing perfectly regulated. "How are you in this building?" Elias choked, taking another step away from the table. "You left a very sloppy digital footprint," I explained, leaning slightly forward. I did not raise my voice, forcing him to strain his ringing ears to catch my precise, calculated syllables. "You assumed a physical distance guaranteed your absolute safety," I continued smoothly. "You anchored your vessel in a private Miami marina, firmly believing a $10 million hull provided an impenetrable fortress. But you fundamentally failed to understand that physical luxury goods are the weakest link in any financial camouflage." Elias reached up and grabbed his chest, his fingers digging painfully into the wrinkled fabric of his designer suit. "I captured the exact alphanumeric registration numbers painted across your fiberglass hull," I stated, watching a bead of sweat drip down his pale neck. "I cross-referenced the maritime registries with your fraudulent biometric pings. When you desperately attempted to forge my retinal scan from your yacht to finalize your emergency transfer, you broadcasted your exact internet protocol address directly into my secure federal terminal." "I used a localized spoofing algorithm," Elias argued weakly, his knees visibly buckling. "You used an outdated commercial masking protocol," I corrected him, tilting my head slightly. "I intercepted your verification request exactly halfway through the transmission tunnel. I hijacked the session authentication completely and redirected the ping away from your Florida location directly into my own hardware." He stared at me, his mind desperately trying to process the catastrophic, systemic failure of his entire criminal architecture. The arrogant ghost who had taunted me through a multi-million-dollar corporate firewall was actively short-circuiting in the middle of a locked boardroom. "You thought your digital evasion was flawless," I whispered, resting my elbows heavily against the cool wood. "You truly thought you could simply tumble $45 million into an anonymous cryptocurrency ledger and vanish forever into a non-extradition paradise." "Marcus authorized the transfer," Elias gasped, wiping heavy sweat from his burning eyes. "Marcus is currently locked out of his own internal banking network," I replied evenly. I reached out and tapped my index finger against the polished table, punctuating the absolute finality of my next statement. "I did not merely deploy an algorithmic freeze on your liquidation request," I explained, holding his panicked gaze. "When I redirected your biometric ping, I authenticated the final transfer myself. I utilized my own pristine federal credentials to completely bypass the Vanguard Apex security checkpoint. I stripped Marcus of his administrative privileges entirely, and I permanently deleted the alias of Julian Cross from the internal registry." Elias grabbed the sharp edge of the mahogany table with both hands to prevent himself from collapsing onto the floor. His knuckles turned entirely white under the crushing, desperate pressure of his grip. "I legally absorbed the entire offshore holding cell," I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the glass walls. "I am now the sole, exclusive administrator of the $45 million trust. The capital is locked behind a biometric wall that only my physical body can open." The horrifying reality of his situation finally breached his absolute, stubborn denial. The meticulously crafted illusion of his new life shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. He had not just lost access to a bank account, he had lost his entire fabricated existence. "You are holding stolen corporate funds," Elias threatened, his voice dropping into a desperate, high-pitched whine. "I am securing a compromised asset," I countered mechanically. I gestured toward the 2 legal folders resting near his white knuckles. "Julian Cross is completely, irrevocably bankrupt," I recited, watching his chest heave with rapid, shallow gulps of air. "The shadow syndicate financing your stolen identity is actively hunting you for losing their operating capital. You cannot run, because your cryptocurrency wallet is entirely empty. You cannot hide, because the local police in Florida are already coordinating a massive federal dragnet based on the verified GPS coordinates I provided them." Elias looked at the death certificate, then back at my face. He opened his mouth, searching frantically for a lie, an excuse, or a manipulation tactic capable of neutralizing the catastrophic damage. He found absolutely nothing. "Your real identity is legally deceased," I whispered, delivering the final execution. "You are a phantom carrying millions of dollars in toxic, fraudulent debt." He stared at his wife across the wide expanse of the heavy mahogany table. For 5 agonizing months, he had treated me as a naive, disposable decoy, an oblivious shield designed to absorb the crushing weight of his shadow liabilities. He had staged his own violent death, stolen my financial stability, and laughed at my grief from the sun-drenched deck of a luxury yacht. He truly believed he was the untouchable, calculating master of his universe. Now, trapped inside a sealed corporate boardroom with no exit, the dead man finally realized the staggering magnitude of his error. He looked deep into my cold, flat eyes and recognized that the woman he had discarded was not a helpless widow. She was the absolute apex predator of his entire financial ecosystem, and she had just swallowed him whole. The absolute silence of the sealed corporate boardroom was shattered by the sound of Elias dragging air into his paralyzed lungs. The crushing realization of his total financial annihilation ripped through his nervous system, stripping away the polished veneer of his stolen identity. For 3 agonizing seconds, he remained completely frozen, staring at the physical bankruptcy documents resting on the polished mahogany wood. His artificial tan turned a sickening shade of gray under the harsh fluorescent lights. His eyes darted frantically toward the reinforced electronic deadbolts sealing the double doors, processing the inescapable reality of his cage. The paralyzing terror did not last. The human brain cannot sustain that level of catastrophic shock without seeking an immediate, destructive outlet. I watched the exact millisecond his overwhelming fear violently mutated into pure, unadulterated rage. The muscles in his neck strained against his expensive silk collar, thick blue veins bulging visibly beneath his sweating skin. His hands, previously trembling with panic over the legal folders, curled into rigid, white-knuckled fists at his sides. He was entirely bankrupt, hunted by a lethal shadow syndicate, and legally deceased. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. Elias let out a guttural, animalistic roar that violently shattered the sterile acoustics of the executive suite. "You belong in absolute poverty!" Elias screamed, thick spit flying from his lips. He did not attempt to negotiate a settlement or beg for a fraction of the stolen funds. He threw his entire body weight forward, launching himself aggressively across the wide expanse of the mahogany table. His expensive designer shoes slipped against the polished hardwood floor, but momentum carried his massive frame directly toward my chair. His heavy knees crashed onto the wooden surface, sending the crystal water pitcher shattering to the ground in a spectacular explosion of glass. "I will kill you for my money," Elias roared, his face twisting with primal fury. His heavy hands slammed down onto the table, violently swiping the falsified death certificate and the bankruptcy filings. The thick legal documents scattered into the air, fluttering uselessly toward the wet floor. He lunged across the remaining distance, his fingers curling into rigid claws aimed directly at my throat. I did not scream for the corporate security team to breach the doors. I did not throw my arms up in a frantic, desperate attempt to block his assault. I maintained a rigid, unyielding posture in the heavy leather executive chair. His large hands clamped down aggressively around my neck, his thumbs pressing painfully into my windpipe. The sheer physical force of his attack pushed my chair backward, the wheels grinding harshly against the dark carpet. A sharp, stinging pressure radiated through my collarbone. My oxygen supply was immediately restricted, causing a dull ache to bloom behind my temples. But my pulse maintained a slow, perfectly calculated rhythm. I looked directly into his bloodshot, manic eyes. He was squeezing with all his remaining strength, desperately trying to reassert his physical dominance over the woman who had just dismantled his entire universe. He firmly believed he was choking the life out of a helpless, defeated victim. He completely failed to realize my right hand was resting completely free on the smooth glass trackpad of my encrypted laptop. "You are nothing without my wealth," Elias spat, his hot breath washing over my face. I tightened my jaw, regulating the restricted airflow through my nose to prevent passing out. I did not attempt to pry his thick fingers away from my throat. I simply lifted my right index finger and tapped the heavy mechanical spacebar of my laptop with a single, deliberate strike. A localized command executed instantly on the glowing screen. A microscopic, high-definition camera embedded directly into the lapel of my dark, tailored blazer clicked softly. A sharp, brilliant green light illuminated on my collar, pulsing with a steady, rhythmic flash. The blinking LED cast a pale emerald glow across Elias's sweat-drenched knuckles. The sudden, unexpected light broke his violent concentration. His grip loosened a fraction of an inch as his bloodshot eyes darted downward, locking onto the pulsing green diode resting against my collarbone. His chest heaved with ragged, heavy breaths, his brain struggling to process the technological intrusion on my clothing. "What is that green light?" Elias demanded, his voice cracking with sudden suspicion. I swallowed hard. Clearing the painful restriction in my bruised throat, I rested my hands calmly in my lap, leaning slightly forward against his loosening grip. "You are currently broadcasting live," I whispered, maintaining a flat, mechanical tone. Elias completely froze, his thumbs going utterly slack against my windpipe. "I am streaming this physical confrontation," I continued, staring dead into his panicked eyes. "Turn that hidden camera off right now," Elias commanded, his hands trembling violently. "The encrypted transmission is not routing to federal authorities," I stated coldly. I watched his pupils dilate, absorbing the terrifying implication of my carefully chosen words. During my forensic audit of Vanguard Apex Financial, I had not merely isolated the $45 million offshore holding cell. I had actively mapped the shadow network financing his stolen identity. I had deployed specialized digital extraction protocols to identify the specific communication nodes utilized by the international criminal syndicate that underwrote his existence. "I established a direct video uplink to your creditors," I explained softly. Elias snatched his hands away from my neck as if my skin had suddenly caught fire. He stumbled backward, sliding off the polished mahogany table and crashing heavily onto the floor. His designer suit soaked up the spilled ice water, but he did not seem to notice the freezing liquid seeping into his trousers. He stared at the blinking green light on my lapel with absolute, unmitigated horror. "You uncovered the hidden syndicate servers," Elias choked, his entire body shaking. "They are watching you grovel right now," I verified, tapping the edge of my laptop. His attempt to liquidate the massive trust into untraceable cryptocurrency had already triggered catastrophic alarms within the criminal organization. They knew he was trying to flee with their operating capital, but until this exact moment, they did not possess the verifiable, physical proof of his absolute betrayal. "I transmitted your complete digital ledger to their executive nodes," I recited smoothly. You gave them my offshore transaction hashes. Elias gasped, clutching his chest. I provided them with your specific flight itineraries, I added, tilting my head. I meticulously detailed the timeline of his deception, ensuring the microphone on my lapel captured every single syllable. I had forwarded the syndicate the exact cryptocurrency tumbling algorithm he intended to use to erase their shares. I had provided them with the high-resolution photographs I captured in Miami, proving he was lounging on a $10 million yacht while claiming to be actively generating their corporate returns. I exposed his desperate plan to steal the entire $45 million for himself and permanently vanish into a non-extradition country with his mistress. They heard every single word you just screamed, I whispered into the quiet boardroom. Elias raised his trembling hands to his face, his breathing reducing to shallow, hyperventilating gasps. The crushing weight of his reality finally shattered his remaining sanity. He was no longer just dealing with a scorned wife or a localized federal fraud investigation. He had just confessed his absolute financial treason on a live, encrypted audio-visual feed to the most dangerous, ruthless men in the world. They will send private contractors to execute me, Elias sobbed, tears spilling down his cheeks. They dispatched a highly armed retrieval team 20 minutes ago, I replied evenly. His leverage was completely obliterated. He had absolutely no money to pay off his staggering debts. He had no stolen identity to hide behind. He had no luxury vessel waiting in a sun-drenched marina. The Shadow Syndicate did not rely on the slow, bureaucratic gears of the federal justice system. They operate with lethal, immediate precision. And I had just handed them his exact geographical coordinates inside a locked corporate boardroom in downtown Chicago. Elias dropped his hands, staggering backward until his spine hit the frosted glass wall of the executive suite. He slid down the smooth glass, collapsing into a pathetic, weeping heap on the dark carpet. The arrogant ghost who had taunted me from the shadows was completely dead. He stared at the blinking green light on my blazer, realizing the absolute finality of his doom. He thought he could bully me into submission, but he had just handed his own execution order directly to the Reapers. The blinking emerald light on my lapel cast a rhythmic, cold glow across the polished mahogany table, silently transmitting the raw terror of the dead man to the most ruthless syndicate bosses in the world. Elias curled his knees toward his chest, pressing his face into the dark carpet. His tailored designer suit absorbed the spilled ice water, completely ruining the expensive fabric. He let out a low, agonizing whimper, his mind entirely broken by the sheer magnitude of his catastrophic miscalculation. I remained perfectly seated in the high-backed executive chair. My pulse held a slow, measured cadence. I did not offer him a single syllable of comfort. I simply watched the man who had stolen my life savings drown in the shallow puddle of his own manufactured reality, before Elias could draw another ragged breath. The heavy electronic deadbolts on the double doors disengaged with a sharp, violent crack. The massive wooden doors were shoved inward with extreme, unyielding force, slamming brutally against the interior walls of the boardroom. Marcus stormed across the threshold. The corrupt wealth manager was completely stripped of his polished, arrogant corporate veneer. His face was flushed, a dangerous, mottled crimson, and heavy streams of sweat poured down his thick neck. He was not alone. Two heavily built private security contractors flanked him, their hands resting aggressively on the tactical holsters strapped to their thighs. They moved with the frantic, undisciplined velocity of men who knew their empire was actively collapsing. Marcus had undoubtedly been monitoring the internal banking network when Elias breached my physical space. He recognized the digital signatures of the syndicate uplink. He knew the offshore bosses were currently watching the live feed, and he knew they would demand immediate, lethal retribution for the missing $45 million. "Secure her wrists immediately," Marcus roared, pointing a trembling, thick finger directly at my chest. The two contractors surged forward, their heavy boots pounding against the hardwood floor. They bypassed the weeping shell of my husband and closed the distance to the head of the table in 3 long strides. "You are going to reverse that transfer," Marcus hissed, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic as he stopped just inches from the edge of the mahogany table. "The syndicate wants their operating capital," Marcus spat, gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "I am going to drag you to the offshore terminal," Marcus threatened, his chest heaving violently. "You will use your biometrics to release the escrow," Marcus commanded, pulling a heavy set of zip ties from his jacket pocket. "I will trade you to the contractors for my survival," Marcus added, leaning over the table. The two-armed thugs flanked my chair, their thick hands reaching out to grab my shoulders and force me out of the seat. They firmly believed they were executing a desperate, high-stakes kidnapping that would magically erase their massive federal liabilities. They completely failed to understand the precise, lethal architecture of the room they had just entered. I did not fight their impending grip. I simply turned my left wrist upward, exposing the face of my silver watch. I watched the slender second hand tick past the 12. The timing was absolutely flawless. "You no longer possess administrative clearance," I whispered, keeping my tone perfectly flat and mechanical. Marcus frowned, his brow furrowing in deep, panicked confusion. I reached my right hand into the deep pocket of my tailored blazer, my fingers wrapped around a small, heavy rectangular device fabricated from solid brushed steel. It was a secure federal transmitter, completely untraceable by standard corporate monitoring software. I withdrew the device and placed it squarely onto the polished mahogany table, right next to the puddle of spilled water. I pressed the single red button located in the center of the transmitter. "What is that device?" Marcus demanded, taking a hesitant, terrified step backward. "That is your eviction notice," I replied smoothly. 3 seconds later, the absolute silence of the corporate fortress violently ceased to exist. A deafening, catastrophic explosion of shattering glass echoed up through the central ventilation shafts of the towering building. The massive, reinforced security doors guarding the ground floor banking lobby had just been completely obliterated by heavy tactical breaching rams. The concussive shockwave vibrated through the floorboards beneath our feet, rattling the heavy crystal fragments scattered near Elias. A high-decibel, multitonal federal alarm system engaged instantly, flooding the executive suite with a blinding, pulsing red light. The rhythmic strobe painted the horrified faces of the men in the room with absolute, crimson panic. "Lock the doors right now," Marcus shrieked, spinning around to face his private contractors. They did not move. The sheer overwhelming volume of heavy tactical boots charging up the central marble staircases paralyzed them entirely. The sound was a relentless, synchronized thunder, representing an overwhelming application of absolute federal force. The shattered remains of the boardroom doors were suddenly flooded with dark, heavy tactical gear. 24 heavily armed agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation poured into the room, their movements displaying the flawless, predatory efficiency of a Tier 1 strike team. They fanned out across the dark carpet, securing every possible sightline within seconds. They raised their matte black assault rifles, locking their laser sights directly onto the chests of the 2 private contractors. "Drop your weapons on the floor," the lead tactical officer barked, his voice echoing with uncompromising, lethal authority. The 2 thugs did not require a second warning. They raised their hands high into the air, completely abandoning their aggressive posture, and dropped heavily to their knees. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped smoothly through the chaotic wall of armed federal agents. He wore a pristine navy blue trench coat layered expertly over a tailored charcoal suit. His face was a mask of cold, analytical stone, radiating an aura of total, unquestionable command. It was Dominic, the Director of Federal Compliance, and my former commanding officer in the Anti-Money Laundering Division. Dominic walked slowly into the boardroom, his leather shoes crunching softly against the broken crystal on the floor. "You have the right to remain entirely silent," Dominic stated, stopping directly in front of the sweating, hyperventilating wealth manager. Marcus collapsed backward, his spine hitting the frosted glass partition with a heavy, sickening thud. He looked frantically between Dominic, the tactical team, and my face, his brain short-circuiting under the crushing weight of the sudden ambush. He had believed he was operating in absolute secrecy, manipulating local laws and bullying a helpless widow to cover his massive corporate embezzlement. "You cannot breach a secure banking trust." Marcus choked, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. "We breached your entire network 3 weeks ago," I corrected him, remaining perfectly seated in the executive chair. I leaned forward, interlacing my fingers and resting them on the mahogany table. I transitioned seamlessly from the role of a desperate widow back into my true identity as a senior federal asset delivering a classified operational briefing. "I established an uplink with Dominic immediately after finding your ledger," I explained, reciting the timeline with icy, mechanical precision. "We recognized the massive scale of your wire fraud instantly," Dominic added, offering a slow, synchronized nod of absolute confirmation. "We needed you to consolidate the capital into a single bottleneck." I continued smoothly, letting the cold reality wash over his panicked mind. "Your emergency biometric protocol was never a defensive measure," I whispered, my voice carrying clearly over the chaos. "It was bait designed to expose your offshore syndicate," I concluded, staring into his panicked eyes. By attempting to lock the $45 million away in the centralized offshore trust, Marcus had unwittingly bypassed his own internal corporate firewalls. He had handed the federal government the exact, unredacted transaction hashes required to seize the stolen funds and issue a lethal round of federal indictments. We had weaponized his own greed to completely dismantle his financial empire from the inside out. Dominic gestured sharply with his right hand. 2 federal agents surged forward, grabbing Marcus by the shoulders and throwing him aggressively against the frosted glass wall. The heavy impact rattled the expensive architecture. The agents yanked his arms forcefully behind his back, securing his wrists with a pair of thick, heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound echoed with absolute, devastating finality. Elias slowly raised his head from the wet, dark carpet. His face was a bloated, unrecognizable mask of tears and terror. He watched the federal agents pat down the corrupt wealth manager, stripping Marcus of his encrypted phone and his corporate access badges. The dead man realized in that exact, horrifying second that his absolute last remaining ally had just been completely neutralized. The sophisticated banker who had promised him untouchable wealth, flawless new identities, and a permanent escape from reality was currently being read his federal rights while pressed face first against a shattered wall. Elias looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing in a silent, desperate plea for a mercy he fundamentally did not deserve. His escape route was permanently severed. The criminal syndicate was actively hunting him. The local police were drafting his murder warrants, and the federal government had just seized physical control of his entire universe. I stood up from the heavy leather executive chair, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer with slow, deliberate movements. I reached down and picked up my encrypted laptop, securing the digital keys to the $45 million trust. The screaming red alarms continued to pulse through the building, painting the faces of the arrested men in a harsh, unforgiving light. Marcus truly thought he controlled the entire banking institution, wielding his executive authority like an impenetrable shield to crush anyone who dared to question his ledgers. He had absolutely no idea that by targeting my husband, he had invited an apex predator into his sanctuary. I walked past his trembling, handcuffed form without a single glance of pity. Marcus thought he had built an untouchable financial fortress, but I had just turned his entire empire into a permanent federal prison. The heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom clicked shut behind me, sealing the weeping wealth manager and the armed federal agents inside their newly constructed glass cage. I adjusted the lapels of my tailored dark blazer, feeling the crisp fabric settle against my shoulders, and walked purposefully down the frosted glass corridor toward the private elevator. The chaotic echoes of the tactical breach still vibrated through the floorboards beneath my boots, a relentless mechanical hum signifying absolute systemic collapse. I pressed the descending button with a steady finger, watching the brushed steel doors slide open with a soft, accommodating hiss. The descent to the ground floor took exactly 45 seconds. I utilized the brief, pressurized isolation to regulate my physiological state, drawing the cool, sterile air in through my nose and pushing it out through my teeth. The operation was not over. Marcus was neutralized, and Elias was currently bleeding his digital life away in front of a live syndicate audience. But a critical loose thread remained unaccounted for within the Vanguard Apex perimeter. I watched the digital floor indicator tick downward, my pulse maintaining a slow, icy rhythm. The elevator doors parted, revealing a ground floor lobby utterly transformed by federal intervention. The pristine marble sanctuary was completely overrun. Heavily armed agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers secured the primary glass, revolving doors, turning away bewildered corporate clients and aggressively directing bank employees against the mahogany teller counters. The screech of encrypted walkie-talkies and sharp staccato commands shattered the carefully curated ambiance of untouchable wealth. The air smelled of ozone, polished stone, and raw, unfiltered human panic. I stepped out of the elevator cabin, keeping my back flush against the cold granite pillars, my eyes sweeping past the detained security guards and the hyperventilating tellers. I scanned the chaotic mass of civilians, tracking the movement near the perimeter. My gaze locked onto a distinct splash of vibrant crimson fabric positioned near the rear service corridor. Chloe stood trembling near a towering potted fern, entirely stripped of the sun-drenched, untouchable arrogance she had displayed on the Miami dock. She pressed her spine hard against the polished marble wall. Her wide, terrified eyes darted frantically across the swarm of federal windbreakers flooding the banking floor. She clutched her diamond-encrusted cellular phone in her right hand, her thumbs tapping the screen with desperate, uncoordinated strikes, waiting for an emergency text from Elias or Marcus that would absolutely never arrive. She looked up, watching two tactical agents drag a handcuffed mid-level bank executive past the decorative indoor fountains. The reality of the catastrophic raid finally penetrated her thick vanity. The grand plan had entirely failed. The $45 million was trapped in an escrow void. Her shadow syndicate sugar daddy was marked for death, and the federal government was currently dismantling the financial fortress brick by brick. Chloe did not rush forward to demand answers or scream for her missing lover. Her survival instincts, honed by years of expertly manipulating wealthy men, activated instantly. She dropped her phone into a nearby metal wastebasket with a sharp, echoing clatter. She bent down, grabbing the thick canvas straps of a heavy black duffel bag resting at her feet. She hoisted the massive bag over her shoulder, the thick canvas straining visibly under the immense, crushing weight of $250,000 in emergency physical cash. She turned her back on the main lobby and moved rapidly toward the discreet service exit, reserved exclusively for catering staff and maintenance crews. She moved with the desperate, frantic velocity of a rat fleeing a sinking ship, fully prepared to completely abandon Elias to his lethal fate just to save her own skin. I stepped out from behind the granite pillar, charting a direct, intercepting trajectory across the polished floor. I moved with smooth, predatory silence, effortlessly bypassing the chaotic clusters of detained corporate employees. I reached the narrow service corridor exactly 5 seconds before she did, planting my heavy boots firmly in the center of the walkway, completely blocking her path to the emergency exit. Chloe rounded the corner, her breathing ragged and shallow, and nearly slammed directly into my chest. She stumbled backward, her expensive designer heels slipping precariously on the waxed linoleum flooring. She gripped the heavy strap of the duffel bag with stark white knuckles, her chest heaving violently under her crimson silk blouse. "Get out of my way!" Chloe commanded, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. I did not flinch, raise my voice, or hurl petty insults regarding her pathetic attempt to flee the jurisdiction. I maintained a cold, impenetrable mask, letting my absolute silence suffocate her frantic, nervous energy. I reached into the deep inner pocket of my tailored blazer and smoothly withdrew a thick, sealed federal envelope bearing the bright red stamp of the Department of Justice. "You are leaving incredibly early," I observed, keeping my tone perfectly flat and mechanical. I held the heavy manila envelope out, keeping it suspended in the stagnant air between us. "I have absolutely no idea who you are," Chloe lied, taking a terrified, trembling half-step backward. "I am the widow you tried to buy," I replied, holding her panicked gaze effortlessly. Chloe looked down at the federal seal, a fresh wave of paralyzing terror washing over her pale face. Her eyes darted frantically toward the exit doors positioned just 10 feet behind my shoulders, desperately calculating the physical odds of pushing past me. She quickly analyzed my balanced, anchored posture and realized I would not yield a single inch. "Take the envelope, Chloe," I instructed, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. She reached out with a trembling, perfectly manicured hand and pulled the thick envelope from my grip. She held it against her chest as if it were a live explosive, her breathing escalating into rapid, hyperventilating gasps. She had built her entire luxurious existence on the assumption that she could always bat her eyelashes and walk away from the burning wreckage of other people's lives. "I just sell real estate," Chloe stammered, fresh tears ruining her flawless, expensive mascara. "You also accept stolen luxury goods," I corrected her, tapping my index finger against my leg. She gripped the heavy duffel bag tighter, pulling it defensively against her shaking hip. "I told you I admired the craftsmanship of your diamond pendant," I continued, reciting the chronological facts with ruthless, measured precision. "I engaged a high-definition macro lens inside that charity ballroom. I captured the microscopic 10-digit alphanumeric serial code laser engraved directly onto your platinum clasp." Chloe stopped breathing entirely, her jaw dropping slightly open in absolute, paralyzed horror. "I ran those specific numbers through the secure federal asset tracking database," I explained, watching the blood drain entirely from her neck. "I matched your specific necklace directly to a heavily monitored offshore wire transfer, originating from a known criminal syndicate." "Elias bought that for me," Chloe choked, shifting the blame with pathetic, desperate speed. "You are a licensed luxury broker," I countered, leaning slightly forward to close the physical distance. "You possess a strict legal fiduciary duty to verify the origin of massive capital transfers. You actively accepted $50,000 in stolen syndicate funds, and you are currently carrying $250,000 in illicit cash." I raised my hand and pointed a steady finger directly at the thick manila envelope trembling in her grasp. "Open the documents," I commanded, my voice slicing clearly through the ambient noise of the raid. Chloe ripped the red security tape with shaking, uncoordinated fingers, pulling a thick stack of premium legal paper from the envelope. Her frantic eyes scanned the bold black text printed across the very top page. It was a finalized, unredacted federal indictment, authorized by the Securities and Exchange Commission, formally charging her with multiple counts of active complicity in severe wire fraud and international money laundering. "I did not know the money was stolen," Chloe sobbed, heavy tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "The federal prosecutors absolutely disagree," I whispered, offering a chilling, completely empty smile. Before Chloe could drop the papers and attempt a desperate, flailing sprint for the side door, 2 female tactical agents stepped silently out of the adjacent maintenance stairwell. They moved with absolute, uncompromising efficiency, boxing the terrified mistress tightly into the narrow corridor. "Place your hands against the wall," the lead agent barked, her voice carrying lethal, unquestionable authority. Chloe completely shattered. She dropped the heavy black duffel bag. The thick canvas hit the linoleum floor with a massive, heavy thud, the sheer density of the illicit cash producing a dull, echoing crack that vibrated against the walls. Her fake, glamorous life entirely disintegrated in that exact, horrifying second. The powerful illusion of her untouchable superiority vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a crying, cornered accomplice facing decades inside a federal penitentiary. "He promised me we were going away," Chloe wailed, turning her face toward the cold concrete wall. "Turn around and surrender your wrists," the second agent ordered, pulling her heavy steel cuffs. The tactical agents forcefully grabbed Chloe by the shoulders, spinning her around and pressing her aggressively against the wall. The sharp, metallic, ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs snapping securely around her delicate wrists echoed loudly in the confined space. They patted her down with practiced speed, swiftly confiscating her secondary phone and her designer clutch. The lead agent reached down and hoisted the heavy black duffel bag, securing the $250,000 in stolen syndicate cash as active, documented federal evidence. Chloe let out a loud, pathetic, high-pitched scream as the agents yanked her arms backward, marching her forcefully back out into the main lobby to be processed with the rest of the corporate criminals. I stood alone in the quiet service corridor, watching her bright crimson blouse disappear into the sea of dark tactical windbreakers. The mistress had truly believed she could simply grab the cash and slip out the back door, completely untouched by the massive explosion she had helped ignite. She thought she was the smartest woman in the room, utterly unaware that every single exit had been permanently sealed the moment she offered me a $500 sympathy check. Chloe dropped her bag and her pride, her entire fabricated existence shattering spectacularly against the cold marble floor as she was dragged away in a humiliating flood of tears. I turned away from the cold concrete walls of the service corridor, leaving the chaotic echoes of the federal lobby far behind me. My leather boots moved silently against the polished marble floor, carrying me steadily back toward the exclusive executive elevators. The ground level of Vanguard Apex Financial was a synchronized, relentless storm of tactical windbreakers and flashing red emergency strobes. I did not linger to watch the corporate executives being herded into armored federal transport vans. My primary objective remained unfinished. I pressed the call button, letting the brushed steel doors seal me inside the quiet, rapidly rising cabin. The digital floor indicator ticked upward, counting down the final seconds of my husband's fabricated existence. I utilized the brief, pressurized isolation to completely regulate my physiological state, pushing a slow, measured breath out through my nose. I stepped out onto the top floor. The frosted glass hallway was completely deserted. The private security contractors were gone. The corrupt wealth manager was currently sitting in a holding cell. The heavy oak doors of the primary boardroom stood slightly ajar, casting a long, sharp slice of bright, fluorescent light across the dark carpet. Dominic stood positioned near the threshold, his arms folded across his tailored charcoal suit. My former commanding officer offered me a single, silent nod of absolute confirmation before stepping aside. I pushed the heavy wooden doors fully open and walked back into the glass suite. The room smelled of spilled ice water, adrenaline, and absolute terror. Elias had not moved from the center of the dark carpet. He was still kneeling exactly where he had collapsed when the federal tactical team breached the perimeter. His expensive designer suit was a wrinkled, damp catastrophe, clinging pathetically to his broad shoulders. The artificial Miami tan on his face was entirely washed away by heavy, relentless streams of panicked sweat and desperate tears. He looked up at me as I crossed the threshold. His bloodshot eyes were wide, frantic, and entirely stripped of the arrogant, untouchable ghost who had taunted me from a sun-drenched yacht just 24 hours ago. The realization of his absolute isolation had finally crushed his respiratory system. He was entirely bankrupt. The ruthless international syndicate was actively hunting his stolen identity. The federal government was preparing his prison cell. He had absolutely zero leverage left in the physical world. But a seasoned manipulator never accepts a total defeat without attempting one final, desperate pivot. He watched me approach the polished mahogany table, his brain frantically searching for a new survival narrative. He wiped his wet face with the back of his trembling hand, leaving a smear of dirt across his cheekbone. He dragged himself across the dark carpet, his knees scraping heavily against the rough fibers, closing the physical distance between us. He reached out with both hands, his fingers hovering just inches from the hem of my tailored trousers, absolutely terrified to actually touch me. "Layla, please," Elias whimpered, his voice cracking violently. I looked down at him, my expression a mask of cold, unyielding stone. This was a terrible mistake. Elias sobbed, fresh tears spilling freely. "You planned a catastrophic fraud," I corrected him mechanically. "I was terrified of the debt. Elias pleaded, gasping for oxygen. He tilted his head back, attempting to project a look of profound, agonizing vulnerability. It was the exact same manufactured expression of pity he had utilized to gaslight me in our Chicago kitchen when he claimed his part-time salary could not cover our basic utility bills. Marcus manipulated me. Elias lied, his chest heaving. You paid a medical examiner, I stated smoothly. I did it for us, Elias choked, his voice rising in pitch. You abandoned me to federal authorities, I whispered evenly. I was coming back for you. Elias lied, his hands shaking. You bought a $10 million yacht, I countered coldly. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head in frantic, pathetic denial. He realized the emotional manipulation was failing to penetrate my armor, so he instantly shifted to his only remaining language. He attempted to leverage the stolen capital. I will give you half, Elias offered, his words rushing together. I tilted my head, keeping my breathing perfectly regulated. $22,500,000. Elias bargained desperately. You have absolutely nothing, I reminded him, my tone flat. I can unlock the escrow, Elias promised, his voice a frantic wheeze. You are locked out forever, I replied, resting my palms against the wood. He ignored the reality of the biometric wall, clinging blindly to the illusion that he still possessed a seat at the negotiating table. He looked up at my face, searching desperately for a flicker of greed, a hesitation, or a single ounce of human empathy. He found a pair of eyes completely devoid of warmth. He was staring into a frozen abyss, looking at a woman who had meticulously burned his shadow empire to the ground without shedding a single tear. I turned my back on his weeping form and focused my attention on the heavy mahogany table. My encrypted laptop sat perfectly aligned next to a thick stack of printed banking documents Marcus had originally prepared for his emergency transfer protocol. I did not need Elias to unlock the escrow void, because the legal architecture of the $45 million had fundamentally shifted the exact moment I deleted the alias of Julian Cross. In the eyes of the global financial registry, the wealthy Canadian expatriate was completely bankrupt, erased, and voided. In the eyes of the state of Illinois, my husband was legally deceased, having suffered a tragic verified drowning accident on Lake Michigan exactly 5 months ago. Therefore, the staggering corporate fortune currently suspended in the digital holding cell had nowhere else to legally anchor. By utilizing my pristine federal credentials to secure the biometric wall, I had not just frozen the capital, I had legally absorbed it. When a massive sum of stolen corporate capital is recovered during a joint federal sting operation, the assets are subjected to strict whistleblower forfeiture laws as the sole, lawful surviving spouse of his original estate and the officially recognized senior federal investigator who mapped the embezzlement syndicate. I possessed the absolute highest tier of administrative clearance. I was the only individual on the planet holding a legitimate, verified, and lawful claim to the funds. I reached into the deep inner pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers brushed against the smooth, cold metal of a heavy silver pen. I pulled it out, gripping the textured barrel with calculated precision. I leaned over the mahogany table and pulled the final, unredacted federal bank authorization form toward the edge of the wood. The heavy parchment paper detailed the absolute seizure and permanent transfer of the $45 million into a secure, heavily monitored federal holding account registered entirely under my name. I always loved you, Layla. Elias wept, his forehead hitting the carpet. I pressed the fine tip of the silver pen against the bottom signature line. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a sudden surge of vindictive joy, and I certainly did not feel a lingering pang of sorrow for the decade I had wasted on his suffocating lies. I felt the pure, unadulterated clarity of a surgeon, amputating a gangrenous limb to save the host. I signed my full legal name with smooth, relentless, flowing strokes. The dark black ink bled into the premium paper, legally finalizing the ultimate claim. I never wanted to hurt you, Elias sobbed, his voice muffled by the floor. I turned around, holding the silver pen loosely in my right hand. I looked down at the dead man cowering at my feet. He was staring up at the signed physical document, his mouth hanging open in a silent, agonizing scream of total, inescapable defeat. Poverty is a quiet prison. Elias, I whispered, my voice slicing clearly through the tense, heavy atmosphere of the boardroom, and you belong in it. I reached over and pressed my right index finger firmly against the biometric scanner embedded in the glass trackpad of my encrypted laptop. The machine hummed softly, casting a pale, highly focused green confirmation light across my knuckles. The screen flashed with a brilliant, undeniable cascading graphic. The artificial smart contract hurdle dissolved instantly into the digital ether. The $45 million vanished from the Vanguard Apex holding cell. The entire staggering fortune was instantly routed through an encrypted federal pipeline, landing securely into the untouchable government holding account under my absolute, singular control. The digital execution was flawless. Elias was left with zero financial leverage, zero legal standing, and zero remaining allies. He was a phantom trapped in the physical world, permanently marked by a lethal international syndicate, and carrying millions of dollars in toxic, fraudulent debt without a single dime to his name. The ghost had been entirely stripped of his sheet. I opened my fingers. The heavy silver pen slipped from my steady grasp. It dropped through the stagnant air and hit the polished mahogany table with a sharp, resounding, metallic crack. The execution was complete. The sharp metallic crack of the silver pen hitting the polished mahogany surface echoed through the glass boardroom, a final gavel strike condemning my husband to a lifetime of ruin. Elias did not reach for the pen. He did not attempt to stand. He remained perfectly frozen on his knees, his forehead resting against the dark carpet, his chest heaving with shallow, ragged, and entirely useless gasps for oxygen. The grand, untouchable financial empire he had meticulously built on my stolen identity had just evaporated into a secure federal holding account. Dominic stepped forward, the heavy soles of his leather shoes breaking the suffocating silence. He raised his right hand, giving a single sharp gesture to the two federal agents stationed by the doorway. They moved with absolute, uncompromising efficiency. The agents grasped Elias by the shoulders of his ruined, sweat-drenched designer suit and hauled him forcefully to his feet. His legs buckled instantly. He hung suspended between the officers, a hyperventilating shell of the arrogant ghost who had taunted me from the sun-drenched deck of a Miami yacht. "Get him out of my sight," Dominic commanded, his voice devoid of any human warmth. They dragged Elias backward through the heavy oak doors. I watched his expensive leather shoes scrape uselessly against the floorboards until the doors swung shut, permanently sealing his fate. Elias was not merely facing decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary for wire fraud, identity theft, and severe international money laundering. He was stepping into a concrete cage marked by a ruthless global syndicate. The offshore bosses who had watched him attempt to liquidate their operating capital on a live encrypted feed were not the kind of men who relied on the American justice system for the rest of his miserable life. Elias would be looking over his shoulder in the prison yard, jumping at every shadow and terrified of every footstep. He had faked his death to escape a mortgage, and now he would spend his actual life begging to survive. His accomplices suffered equally spectacular falls from grace. Chloe, the luxury real estate broker who believed she was smart enough to launder syndicate cash and steal another woman's husband, completely shattered during her federal interrogation. She signed a desperate plea deal, accepting a mandatory 5-year sentence in a federal correctional institution. The glamorous Miami lifestyle, the $50,000 diamond pendants, and the endless vintage champagne were violently replaced by a standardized cotton jumpsuit and a stainless steel toilet. Her fabricated superiority crumbled the moment the heavy iron bars slammed shut. Vivian experienced a uniquely poetic destruction, without Elias secretly funneling embezzled corporate funds to support her lavish lifestyle. Her curated aristocratic facade disintegrated overnight. The creditors seized her custom silk morning gowns and liquidated her offshore accounts. She was unceremoniously evicted from her sprawling Gold Coast apartment. the woman who had proudly stood at a mahogany podium, leveraging her son's fake death to solicit fraudulent charity donations, now resided in a cramped, drafty studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. To survive, Vivian was forced to take a minimum-wage job as a greeter at a massive discount retail store. She spent her days wearing a cheap, bright blue nylon vest, standing on hard concrete floors for 8 hours a shift, and forcing a polite smile for the exact working-class citizens she had spent her entire life mocking. She was finally living in the suffocating, inescapable poverty she had always believed I deserved. 6 months later, the freezing winds of Chicago whipped aggressively against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new executive office. I stood looking out over the sprawling city skyline, resting my hands lightly against the cool glass. My pulse maintained a slow, perfectly rhythmic cadence. The suffocating anxiety of my past was entirely healed, leaving behind a foundation of absolute, unyielding stone. I had not walked away from the Vanguard Apex raid empty-handed. By lawfully seizing the $45 million and transferring it to the federal government, I triggered a massive, mandatory whistleblower reward. I utilized that staggering injection of clean, untraceable capital to build my own empire. I launched an elite, independent anti-money laundering and corporate risk assessment firm situated on the top floor of a downtown high-rise. The heavy glass door to my office clicked open. Dominic walked in, holding a thick, encrypted legal portfolio. He did not enter as my commanding officer. He walked in and took a seat at the massive obsidian desk as my equal partner. We had spent the last 6 months dismantling corrupt banking networks and untangling the darkest financial webs in the world. We no longer worked for the system. We dictated the terms of the system. I turned away from the skyline and walked toward the obsidian desk, smoothing the crisp lapels of my tailored black blazer. I sat down in the high-backed leather chair, interlacing my fingers and resting them on the cool surface. I'd spent a decade believing that shrinking my own potential would earn me a place in a stable family. I had allowed toxic, manipulative parasites to convince me that I was a naive, disposable decoy. True power is never found in hiding behind false identities, purchasing stolen luxury goods, or manipulating vulnerable people. True power is found in mastering the undeniable truth, in possessing the quiet, lethal discipline to audit the darkest lies and drag them forcefully into the light. Elias had tried to build an entire universe out of shadows and fabricated ledgers, but he had fundamentally failed to understand the most basic principle of forensic accounting. The numbers never lie. Only the people who write them do. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey, navigating a toxic family dynamic and untangling the psychological webs of a manipulative partner can be one of the most isolating and devastating experiences a person can face. But you absolutely do not have to carry their burdens forever, and you never have to accept a narrative written by someone who wants to see you fail. Have you ever had to draw a massive line in the sand and set a hard, permanent boundary with a toxic partner or family member who tried to manipulate your life? How did you finally break free from their control and reclaim your own power? I would absolutely love to hear your stories of survival and success in the comments section down below. Your experiences truly matter, and your strength can inspire someone else who is currently fighting their own silent battle. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more content about overcoming betrayal and building a beautiful, independent life, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Stay strong, always trust your own instincts, and never forget your true worth.